Death is only the beginning. For Lion von Marbus, heir of a fallen necromancer bloodline, those words became fate. Forced to execute his own father, he embraced the darkness his enemies feared. With a demonic contract and the family's forbidden grimoire, he commands the dead themselves. Once mocked as relics of a cursed past, the Marbus name will rise again. But will Leon rebuild his legacy, or be consumed by it? Let's find out. The hoarse cries of soldiers cut into his ears, united by only one goal: to destroy the Pale Devil, a man named Nox von Leenhaber, in a desperate attempt to restore peace to the land. The protagonist, Lion, looked at this man and thought that it all began, as always, by the whim of fate. A huge army of monsters and people all at once ran towards a single enemy, and their commander gave the order to kill this vile devil. Monsters and people roared, getting closer and closer to him, and Lion meanwhile thought that the words spoken by his once loyal comrade and friend, he remembered them well, although he did not fully understand the meaning of what was said. The commander ordered the soldiers not to let the devil leave here alive, and when one of the monsters pounced on Nox, he imbued his sword with devilish flames and made several swings, dealing with the soldiers. MC continued to think about him, one thing firmly imprinted in his memory. As he spoke these ominous words, a tear of sadness slipped from his lowered eyes. Nox rushed forward towards the winged demon and struck it down with a single blow of his sword, after which he sank to the ground. This defeated all the soldiers, and he reached Lion. When they met, MC asked him to at least tell him now why he turned against them. At that moment, Nox remembered the girl who also asked what compelled him to make a deal with the devil. Why did he decide to betray them all? Because of this, he smirked and noted that his words reminded him of someone. But should he say anything when things had gone this far? Lion said that maybe it made no sense to him, but not to him. So why did he leave them? Nox's gaze instantly turned cold, and he said that if he really needed an answer, and if he wanted to end the suffering, then all that was needed was to take his life. He himself understands perfectly well that he has only one path. MC replied that if this was his true desire, then he would gladly honor it, after which he used his magic and raised soldiers from the dead. Monsters and people turned into undead and became Lion's personal army, which he immediately sent into the attack. As soon as Nox dealt with them, chopping them apart, their wounds healed and they rose from the dead again and rushed into battle. MC did not give the undead a break. They all fell upon Nox at once, and he continued to chop them down with a cold expression. When he was finished with them, he turned towards the Necromancer and ran towards him, saying that he had become significantly stronger. The pages of the Necromancer's book quickly flipped, searching for another spell. Lion formed a huge magic circle behind his back, from which two crossed swords first appeared, and he agreed with Nox's words. After that, a huge demon appeared behind him, which he immediately sent into attack. Nox smirked in response, and three eyes appeared behind him, after which he rushed forward, summoning a sharp gust of wind. MC staggered, almost losing his balance, and when he looked up, he saw an enemy above him, ready to bring his sword down on him. When a purple flame flashed before his face, he froze, but his summoned undead protected him from the blow. He looked into the eyes of his enemy and said that if he had to kill him and listen to the report from the lips of the living dead, then so be it. Why did Nox von Leenhaber suddenly turn away from them, leaving behind unfading scars? Why did the one he thought he knew so well hide from the whole world, preferring solitude as a faithful companion? It will be a long duel because one of them will fall dead on this battlefield. Let's go back in time a little. His father lay on the guillotine, the sinister edge of the razor-sharp blade casting a shadow on his dark brown hair, the darkest, most terrible shadow that can ever hang over the soul, and he stood next to him with a knife in his hand and looked at it. The people gathered for the spectacle whispered they felt very sorry for the Lord. The woman looked at his lordship with pity and asked what he had done to deserve such humiliation. The man standing next to her whispered that she should be silent, or she would be next. Hadn't she seen enough to understand how ruthless these people were? She agreed with him, but still wanted to object, and he said that all they could do was keep quiet and stay out of their way. War was now thundering across the continent. Ordinary people like them were given no choice but to do nothing and remain silent. Crows cackled in the sky, harbingers of death, a time of war and strife. As bloodshed erupted across the eastern continent, deadly conflicts simply refused to subside, leading the noble house of Marbus to fall as the last victims of a hellish conflict. Lord Rune von Marbus understood everything. He accepted his death and closed his eyes. Thus, desperate times call for desperate measures. The strong act as they please, while the weak are forced to steal to survive. Unlike the strong, the weak are forced to risk their lives every day, having no choice but to dance with death itself. A veritable hellish gate, where the weak can only await sweet release from suffering. Such a terrifying picture the continent has been reduced to in recent days. The head of the noble house of Sylvester, the primary rival of House Marbus, Count Alan de Sylvester, was now enjoying the upcoming spectacle from the front row. He announced the beginning of the execution, and the people began to whisper anxiously, while young Lion stood on the scaffold next to his father, not daring to move. The Count bowed his head slightly in displeasure and asked, "What is the meaning of this?" Didn't he hear his order to begin? MC staggered in horror, gripping the knife with both hands, and then approached the rope that held the blade. The Count, already impatient to see death, smiled and ordered the boy to cut the rope. The poor boy approached his father on trembling legs, then raised the knife above his head, and everyone held their breath. As soon as he cut the rope, the blade fell, followed by a splash of blood and a dull thud. The dark truth is that the sound of human death is no different from the sound of a carcass being cut from a butcher's shop. Droplets of scarlet blood spattered the white canvas depicting the boy's face, completing the horrific picture of inescapable reality with the smell of iron. And, according to the cruel cliché of fate, these events will settle like an unbearable burden on the shoulders of the young man. Lion glanced at his reflection in the pool of blood spreading across the scaffold and realized that he had just rid the world of Rune von Marbus. He had severed the link between his father and the mortal world. Yes, he, Lion von Marbus, the son of the late Rune von Marbus, the murderer who carried out his own father's sentence. He soon took up the duties of the head of the family, the representative of his noble line. As the name suggests, these are not just any aristocrats, they are the pillars of an entire nation. However, as one famous playwright wrote, "Heavy is the head that wears the crown." Therefore, the burden of power should be borne only by those who are capable of bearing it. Long live the new head of the Marbus family, Leon von Marbus. As soon as he assumed his new title, a council convened. One of the vassals excitedly said that Sylvester's sphere of influence was growing day by day, and it wouldn't be long before they openly invaded the lands of House Marbus. The other councillors agreed with him, demanding that the head of the house make a decision. They needed to strengthen their defenses. They all waited for a wise answer from him, but Lion was still unprepared. He concluded the meeting and said that he must ask them to be patient a little longer. He needed more time to weigh everything. They objected, saying that the matter was urgent, and he left, their words saying that this did not bode well for the once great House Marbus. As he headed to his office, he thought about how he had come to this point. After the untimely death of his father, he had risen to the role of head of the family at the tender age of 14. House Marbus, once revered as a powerful line of necromancers, had fallen into oblivion, its former glory gone. Noticing portraits on the wall, he stopped and walked closer. They were of his father and mother. He asked them what they would do in his place, then continued on his way. He knew perfectly well that his questions would remain unanswered. The dead do not speak, and his parents would not share their wisdom with him from the afterlife. Nevertheless, he desperately needed guidance. How could he restore glory and prosperity to his house? He glanced at the portrait above the enormous doors. It depicted Wellen von Marbus. He was the founding ancestor of House Marbus, the only necromancer on the continent of his era. It was known that their house first gained recognition after the founder made a name for himself on the battlefield. But even during the founder's heyday, no more worthy necromancers emerged from the line, tipping the scales toward inevitable decline. He sighed heavily and pushed open the door, thinking that in the end, it all came down to the murder of his own father. He entered the head of the house's office, approached the desk, and ran his hand over the chronicles of their family. The founder was almost a legend. With a wave of his hand, he could sweep away his enemies like a deadly storm, calling forth waves of the dead in an inexorable march. Over time, the western regions submitted to his conquest in just a few months. Rumor has it that Wellen von Marbus made a pact with the demon Marbus and acquired one of the continent's greatest secrets, the secret of necromancy from the dread Necronomicon, which allowed him to command death itself in these lands. This book now lay before him, a priceless relic passed down directly from the founder, and the very book that had led House Marbus to the dawn as the only line of necromancers on the entire continent. When he opened the Necronomicon, an ominous voice rang out, telling Lion to heed it. He froze for a second in surprise, then looked up in surprise and thought, a telepathic message straight to the headmaster's office? Despite the anti-magic field, he looked around and asked if he could ask who he had the honor of speaking with. The voice called him his child and told him not to be afraid. He was not an enemy to him or his loved ones. He wondered why he should suddenly take his word for it, and then someone's aura enveloped him and transported him to another place. When he looked up, he saw a huge black lion with horns in front of him, and asked what kind of place this was. It was a demon, Marbus himself. He pointed at himself in confusion and asked if his predecessor hadn't seen fit to tell him about his existence. MC didn't understand what he was talking about and asked if he was talking about his father, Rune von Marbus. The lion confirmed this and said that he felt as if the thread connecting them was broken. His face twisted into a vicious grin and he growled curses, saying that it was not without reason that he was worried about his kindness, which was excessive for the Lord of the Dark Clan. He should have realized that his end was approaching. In any case, let him answer whose handiwork this was. MC answered him that if he was talking about who exactly killed his father, then it was he, his own son. He did not hesitate to say this, and then the demon growled, bringing down strong pressure on him. He gave him another chance to answer and, already on the verge of rage, asked if he was the one who killed his oath-bound contract. Leon looked at him confidently and again fearlessly declared that he was the one who killed his own father. The demon growled menacingly. It seemed he did not believe him, and therefore he wanted to personally see what happened. He penetrated his memory, saw how he cut the rope, and how Rune's head fell. Having learned what had happened, he calmed down and said that he wasn't telling the whole story. The hand that cut the rope might have been his, but that didn't mean he was his father's killer. MC told him that wasn't true, and he knew it. Not knowing what to say, Marbas sighed heavily and decided to put aside his despair for now, which was truly beyond his comprehension, and noticed the aura of darkness that he felt inside him, an all-consuming abyss lurking behind the outer shell. What had this child survived? How could such a simple child still harbor such a reserve of magical power? He looked at his feet and saw the mountain of bodies he was standing on, and the energy emanating from him. He thought in surprise that this was simply unthinkable. He was capable of surpassing even his ancestor. He cleared his throat, pulling himself together, and then said that he should introduce himself. He is Marbas, one of the 72 demons of hell who turned away from the demonic world and chose peaceful coexistence with humans. He is a loyal friend of Wellen von Marbas and a source of necromancy, which has become the hallmark of that house. Lion noted that legends are made about him. When their progenitor founded the Marbas line, wasn't it he who taught him the forbidden art of necromancy? The demon confirmed this and said that although he is now bound to the Necronomicon, he was once a formidable demon. Lion's face darkened, and he said that their progenitor often said that necromancy is in their blood. But how did it happen that he ultimately abandoned them? Marbas inquired where this opinion came from, and he said that since the time of the progenitor, House Marbas has not produced necromancers of his caliber. What is this if not a sign that he has turned his back on them? The Black Lion looked at him closely and decided to clarify one thing. The reason he and his family couldn't wield necromancy to their full potential was because they were too weak to provide a suitable vessel. MC didn't understand what he was talking about and told him that none of them could hold a candle to the blazing talent Wellen possessed. This was the reason for the decline of their glory. Lion thought about his words, then nodded and said that he believed him. The demon noted that he had quickly come to terms with this, and he said that it was obvious, an inevitable outcome for weaklings who suffer one defeat after another in war. Marbas asked if that was why he had also resigned himself to the inevitable death of his father. He answered that it didn't matter now. To be honest, his demise was nothing special. However, before he completely turned his back on their kind, he would like to ask him for one favor. Marbas immediately refused him, saying that a favor is an act of kindness in which one party leaves with nothing. Any contract with a demon should be treated as a deal. MC agreed and said that in this case he would like to ask him for a deal regarding the Necromancer's power. Marbas was intrigued and asked if it was within his power to grant him this. The Black Lion wagged his tail and proudly raised his head, asking why a boy like him cared about his powers. What was so special about him that he would grant him power? Did he think he had the potential to develop it? He confidently confirmed this, and noted that if he were a complete mediocrity, a higher demon like him would not have deigned to say a word to him. They say that ordinary people lose all their mana and hallucinate only when talking to a demon, and when the demon has had enough of playing, they die altogether. Considering that he is still alive, this can only mean one thing. He has at least a bit of potential. Marbas mentally noted that this boy was certainly not without talent and possessed remarkable intelligence. He reminded him that any pact with a demon should be considered a deal, and Lion replied that he remembered that well. He wasn't so foolish as to believe that he had anything to offer in return. The Black Lion stared at him in surprise, then burst into loud laughter and declared that this was excellent. They needed to make a deal quickly. MC asked what he would demand of him, and Lion, grinning slyly, replied that he wanted every single part of his being. Lion froze for a moment, then smirked and said that he was so glad to hear that his pathetic nature was still worth something. Marbas was slightly surprised, and meanwhile the council meeting continued. Kirchel von Marbas said that, as they undoubtedly already knew, the current head of the family, Leon von Marbas, was endowed with a measure of power that allowed him to make significant decisions affecting their entire house. He hoped there were no dissenters. The vassals remained silent, and he declared that, as the head's uncle and closest blood relative, he would then assume responsibility for making important decisions directly affecting the future of the house. He asked everyone present to speak out on his self-proclamation, and one of the advisors said it would be foolish to object, considering the alternative. An immature puppy. They could not abandon their fates to a naive child. He was certain there was no more worthy candidate for the role of head of the family than his uncle. Pullen said that, be that as it may, Lord Lion was the only direct descendant of the previous head. There had never been a precedent in the family for appointing an indirect descendant as head. Another vassal asked indignantly, who cared about precedents when every member of the line was at stake? An army of those bandits from the Sylvester line was already marching on their doorstep. He clutched his head, and said that he did not blame him for doubting the proper succession, but he should know that choosing an ignorant successor was the same as choosing death. His priority was survival. Poland slammed his fist on the table and jumped up, indignantly exclaiming, how could he even say such a thing? Each of them had been granted a place at this table by the grace of the previous lord. In the name of this line, they were obligated to fight to the last, and not bicker like a pack of jackals. He became nervous and thought that even if the current head had not yet consolidated his power, he would not simply stand by and watch his own uncle usurp his rightful place as heir. He imagined him in the place of the head of the house and felt sick. Why did Lord Rune abandon them to the mercy of this shameless vulture? Kirchel stood up and walked around his chair, saying that their current leader seemed to have at least one loyal subject. Poland gave him a disapproving look and asked him to speak more frankly. What did he mean? He replied that those as ardently loyal as himself often lacked insight, which prevented him from recognizing when things were bad. He walked menacingly toward him and, touching his shoulder, released his power and asked him to accept his wise advice with all clarity. Did he truly believe that he had gathered them all today because he cared so much about their opinions? Poland realized that he had planned everything from the beginning and cursed, and the man advised him to carefully consider everything that followed, if not for himself, then at least for his family. He stopped releasing his power and said that they had all gathered here for one purpose, to make a difficult choice within the framework of the lesser evil for this house. So let him not stand in the way of their survival. He asked him only to allow their wisdom to set the right course. Poland did not dare to object and mentally apologized to Lord Rune. He had originally been just a pawn in his game, therefore he asked him to have mercy on his pathetic vassal, unable to protect his legacy. Meanwhile, Lyon awaited the demon's decision. He looked at him thoughtfully and said that everything was fine, except for one thing. With this change in their contract, the true extent of his powers would be curtailed. Although Rune was soft and naive for a contractor, he possessed a much larger mana reserve than he currently possessed. MC said he recalled that any demon making a deal with a human must drink the contractor's magical powers to replenish their reserves. What should he do for this? He replied that there was one wonderful thing, but they would spare his mana for now. After these words, he snapped his fingers, and the red mist enveloping Lion began to return to the Necronomicon and thicken. Afterwards, a small version of the Black Lion emerged from the red flash, and he remarked that he would have a little difficulty maintaining his current form. Lion tilted his head with interest and remarked that he was charming enough to pass off as his pet. Marbus didn't like this at all, and threatened to rip his face with his claws and teeth if he called him charming again. Did he understand? He replied that it would be unpleasant, after which the Black Lion walked around him with displeasure and said that since they understood each other, they needed to go. He inquired where exactly they were going, and he turned around, asking if he wanted to gain power comparable to his ancestors or not. He confirmed this, and the Black Lion said that if he hoped to reach the same heights as him, what could be better than following his example, literally? MC thoughtfully noted that this was logical, after which Marbus opened a portal in front of him and said that they would be heading to a closed shrine to his ancestors. On this journey, he might have to risk his life. Was he ready to follow him despite this? He tilted his head to the side in response and asked in confusion why he was even asking about his determination. Marbus liked his answer and went ahead, saying that he would show him the way if he was able to keep up. After that, they found themselves in a forest. Lion looked around and noted that this place was quite mysterious. Marbus confirmed this. This forest could very well be an impassable labyrinth for those who do not belong to the bloodline. MC remembered that his father said that only the rightful head of the lineage could enter the closed shrine. But the strange thing is, if one could gain the power of a necromancer in this place, then why couldn't his predecessors? The demon answered him that it was all because none of them could successfully pass the trials. He thinks they were unable to satisfy the fundamental condition. Only those who possess the purest shade of the attribute of darkness are able to pave the way to the shrine. Until now, no one has been able to fulfill the first condition and make their way through this fog. Lion glanced at the bright clot of magic and noted that it looked quite thick. Marbus raised his paw and announced the beginning of the test, after which MC entered the shrine and began descending the stairs. As soon as he took the first step, Marbus advised him to be more careful and not to expect any help from him from now on. Lion agreed. After all, he himself had told him that this was a test of his fortitude, and the demon added that he still had one final piece of advice. Always try to follow the instructions in the Necronomicon. The book glowed brightly and began to fly near him, drawing his attention, and the demon smiled slyly, saying that it would lead him to his desired reward, the power of a necromancer. After that, they continued forward until someone roared from the side. MC stopped and walked toward the source of the sound. The torches began to glow green, illuminating a long corridor, and soon he came out into a large hall where a group of goblins were. He also heard someone crying. A tied-up girl was sitting on the floor, crying. He took the Necronomicon, opened it, and stopped at the first page, which described the instructions for use. The first was the secret of raising the dead. While he was reading the book, the goblins were already ready to attack. The book said that first he needed to take lives, and he closed the book and pulled out a knife, intending to do so. He looked indifferently at the girl, then at the goblin standing in front of him, and prepared for battle. Immediately after that, he took off, as did the goblin who ran towards him. The monster wanted to hit him, but he failed, and Lion, clutching the weapon tighter, swung his hand, dealing him a fatal blow. Looking at the body, he prepared for another fight, and said that this would be the first life. When he was little, his father took him to the cemetery and told him to listen carefully. In the great house of Marbus, what exactly did he think they valued most? The answer was simple. They exalted death itself, because they were necromancers who commanded the dead. Therefore, they revered death itself above all else. The boy thought about his words and asked how one could revere death. He thought that necromancers were obliged to take lives, whether they wanted to or not, if they wanted to gain power, like other dark mages. Wasn't that so? Rune noted that he had studied his family history carefully. True. They, dark mages, instilled fear in many people throughout the world, but that didn't mean they had to become heartless villains. Therefore, let him promise him one thing. Whoever he met in battle, as long as he held the power over life and death in his hands, let him try to end them as gently as possible. Now MC wondered if he should keep that promise to all his enemies. He glanced at the monsters around him. They all stood there, hesitating to approach him because of the death of their kin. He thought he should aim for the neck vertebrae with deadly precision. There was no less painless way to kill an enemy. Marbus, meanwhile, mentally noted that this child didn't look particularly trained in swordplay, and yet he struck the spine with incredible accuracy. Was he just lucky? Or was it some kind of innate gift? But he would find out soon. He smiled in anticipation, while Lion thought that he had managed to defeat one, but that was more luck than skill. Goblins are cunning and treacherous by nature. Fighting them all at once was not the best solution. He gripped the blade tighter, bracing himself for every unexpected blow, and looked around, thinking that it was difficult to judge height in the darkness. Not only that, but his field of vision was fading with each passing second. It seemed that the torch had gone out with the first goblin he killed. He needed to try to get used to the darkness while he still could. Then, instead of cutting his way through crowds of enemies, he needed to pierce and move as precisely as possible. Breaking into motion, he ran behind the goblin, thinking that he needed to pierce and move as precisely as possible. Aiming at its neck, he lunged forward, and the steel pierced its body, causing it to scream loudly. At the same moment, another torch went out, and one of the goblins growled loudly. Now they decided not to continue standing still, but to attack him all at once. When two of them pounced on him from both sides, he reacted quickly and pulled back, causing them to collide with each other, then swung his knife, killing another one. Another torch went out, his eyes increasingly adjusted to the darkness. He already saw much more clearly, but unfortunately, his blade was badly damaged by claws, so he thinks that's all he can expect from the ceremonial blade. Noticing a looming shadow above him, he looked up and saw a goblin deciding to pounce on him. He immediately reacted and swung his hand forward, throwing a knife at him. The blade cut his cheek and flew past, while the lion, surprised, thought, did he just throw away the weapon? MC jumped aside, dodging the blow, and, carefully watching his enemy's every move, approached the sword lying nearby. He took it, and the black lion began to watch him closely, after which he turned to the goblin and lunged forward, piercing his body through. Blood gushed from his wound. Lion drew his sword and delivered a horizontal blow, finally dealing with him. Looking at the fallen body, he turned and slowly walked towards the girl who had been waiting for help all this time. He removed the rope from her mouth, and she burst into tears, thanking him for saving her. But then cold steel pierced her body, and her eyes widened in surprise. He plunged the sword into her, which she clearly did not expect, then pulled it out, and looking at the bloody blade, said that he remembered another piece of wisdom said by his father about monsters capable of imitating human appearance, which he had encountered during his wanderings across the continent. He plunged the sword into her shoulder, causing her to scream loudly and already beginning to show her true nature. Lion also remembered that he sternly asked him not to forget that not everyone deserved a quick death. They should experience the same despair and fear that their victims endured. He smirked and told the girl that she could use a little lesson in pain. A loud scream echoed throughout the dungeon, and then the last torch went out. Meanwhile, the self-proclaimed head of the house was enjoying himself in some establishment with his ally and a bunch of ladies. He laughed loudly and exclaimed that it was finally his turn. Just a little while longer, and the house would be in his hands. The woman, smirking, said that it would be so. Would anyone object if such a respectable gentleman took over the leadership instead of a completely immature boy? The second girl, sitting in his arms, said that it was simply incredible. She would never have thought that he would use Count Sylvester to get what he wanted. The woman moved closer to him and said that making a deal with the enemy to rise to the top was a truly manly act. Kirchhoff laughed and said she flattered him, although they would have to bow to the idiots from House Sylvester for a while. He took a few sips of alcohol, then said that it was even better than coddling Lion, who would inevitably drag Marbus down the path to extinction. Of course, it would be 100 times better if he took matters into his own hands. And anyway, winners are not judged. He continued laughing loudly, after which the vassal asked what he planned to do with Leon. The people at the estate were still deeply loyal to his father, so moving the boy might be more difficult than he thought. Kirchhoff said there was no need to complicate things. He was very busy, after which he laughed maliciously and said that they would simply announce his untimely death after the fact. He himself understood that the dead do not speak, and their children should not either. The vassal remarked that this was well said. He believed the last time the dead spoke was hundreds of years ago, back in the days of the founder, a skilled necromancer. Kirchhoff poured him a drink, after which he proposed a toast to the next rightful head of the line, Sir Kirchhoff. The man laughed loudly, after which they both drank and continued their dinner. Meanwhile, Count Alan de Sylvester gathered his men and asked if the plan to subjugate the Marbus line was going smoothly. One of his subordinates confirmed this, saying that the Eminence Grace Kirchhoff von Marbus had essentially already secured his place in their plan. So, all they had to do was wait for official confirmation from the Imperial Palace for all-out war. Alan chuckled and called them incorrigible idiots. How foolish of them to assume he would refrain from a second military campaign just because the first had ended so recently. Well, that only made their task easier. One of his subordinates said that this would not have been possible without his excellent strategic thought, and he, picking up a photograph from the table, asked what the name of that scoundrel was. Kirchhoff? Who would have known that the centuries-old history of the House of Marbus would come to an end at the instigation of a short-sighted traitor? What a delightful night awaited them. He waved his hand and ordered his subordinates that everything must be ready on time, after which he grinned and said that first the father, now the son. He cannot wait to hear the sweet sounds of despair. MC by this time finished off the last monster in the dungeon and sighed, noticing that with the dying of the last torch, nothing was visible here. Was this creature the last of them? Immediately after that, the torches lit up again, but with a normal flame. He sighed with relief and adjusted his hair, and the Black Lion exclaimed that this was incredible. He had never seen such crazy contractors in his memory. He jumped right at him in joy, which the boy certainly didn't expect. He lost his balance and fell straight into a pool of blood, and Marbus, slapping his cheeks with his paws, joyfully exclaimed that he had enough strength to survive even in a camp full of orcs, if only he could control himself. Lion remained silent, enduring the actions of the ancient demon, and Marbus exclaimed that even though it was a monster under the mask, its human form was indistinguishable, and he still killed it after barely looking at it. MC stood up and, removing it from himself, said that he would prefer to avoid a full camp of orcs if possible. They say that they despise humans more than any other species. He wanted to continue, but the Black Lion was very agitated and told him that it didn't matter at all. Let him tell me instead. How did he understand that the last monster was in league with the others? Lion thought for a few seconds, then told him it was simple. It was the torch. One of them was still burning when the others had gone out. The Black Lion, excited, asked him to continue, and he said that when they first entered this place, he immediately noticed that the torches were burning a slightly different color than before. The flames were greenish. He recognized them as the shadows of the dead, and as a sign of confirmation, with each monster killed, these torches went out, one by one. And then he noticed that, even though he had killed the goblins, not all the torches had gone out. This led him to believe that the last monster was hiding somewhere, and that as long as it lived, it could go no further. Marbus listened to him with admiration the whole time, and remarked on his frightening composure. He hadn't expected a 14-year-old to be so quick-witted in such harsh conditions. When someone's life is at stake, it's not so easy to read the situation, nor to act without a second's hesitation. And yet, Lion handled it flawlessly, dealing with all the enemies single-handedly. There's more to him than just a good supply of mana. Perhaps he even harbors something completely special. All of this intrigues him so much, he's eager to see what happens next. He took out a book and said that since he passed Welland's first test, they'd move on to the next one. MC opened the book to the first page, but since he'd already followed the instructions, he flipped through it. After taking lives, it's necessary to raise the fallen. He glanced at the pile of dead bodies lying on the floor, and realizing what it meant, he smirked. The Black Lion told him to look at the goblins he'd killed, and then direct mana to his eyes to expand his field of vision. He will see a thread stretching from each body, leading in an unknown direction. Lion did everything as he said, and threads really did stretch from the bodies. Marbus said that necromancers among themselves call this the line of death. He asked, so the threads connect the souls of this world with the other world? The demon confirmed this, and, pulling the thread, said that necromancers separate the lingering souls of the dead from their bodies, in order to bring them back to life, and breathe them back into the bodies, mixing in a little of their own mana, provoking their rise as undead. At that moment, The goblins began to rise from the dead, and a mark appeared on each of their foreheads. The Black Lion decided to demonstrate how necromancy works, then swung his paw, and the goblin immediately rushed towards Lion, swinging his sword at him. But after a second, he stopped, without striking. The demon said that this process could be considered a kind of branding. Of course, there are other ways to create undead puppets, but this is the only method that works with monster bodies. He'll save the rest for later. MC stood up and said he understood everything, and Marbas invited him to try it himself. But before they began, he decided to ask him one question that had been lingering in his head. His predecessor had said that turning a person into a walking dead is much more difficult than turning a monster into one. Does he think he can reach the level where he can turn people? Marbas noticed that he sounded like someone who would soon need it, and he replied that perhaps that was true. The Black Lion smiled slyly and asked who this poor fellow was, and he answered that it was Kirchall von Marbas, his only uncle. Time passed, and Kirchall continued to relax with the ladies and his friend, having a good time. Taking another sip of alcohol, he exclaimed that the previous head had been a brainless idiot, and yet his life was clearly improving after his death. This is the natural state of affairs for fate's favorite, isn't it? The man agreed with him and said that all that remained was for him to take care of the last heir. He was sure the burden on his shoulders would immediately become lighter. Kirchall waved his hand and said that killing the boy was a piece of cake. He joyfully raised his hand, inviting them to raise their glasses and drain them. Such significant moments were especially precious. Suddenly, a noise was heard and everything shook. The cable holding the chandelier snapped and fell with a crash onto the table, causing the ladies to scream in fear. The lights went out, and Kirchall immediately became wary. The woman said with concern that this building was guarded by a powerful magical artifact. It would take something more terrifying than the wind to shake the entire building. Kirchall looked around carefully, then put his finger to his lips and told the girl to be quiet. He loudly asked, "Who's there?" On Marbas territory, not a single living soul dared attempt his life. His nephew's voice came from the side, asking why he was so sure. Kirchall glanced at the balcony exit. His nephew stood behind a translucent curtain. Lightning flashed, and an ominous rumble echoed. The man grinned, and noted that the young head of an oppressed clan had arrived. He waved his hand, summoning his guards, and Lion said it was so kind of him to acknowledge him as the head of the house. Kirchall grinned and said he saw no reason for such a late visit, especially without warning. Did he have some urgent business with him? MC remarked that this was a rather odd question. Does a landlord need permission to visit a subordinate who isn't even a proper vassal? Should he really give notice for the sake of convenience? Kirchall frowned and replied sarcastically that he thought a worthy lord wouldn't need such courtesy, but they both knew he was far from being worthy. He started shouting and waved his hand, asking if he was afraid his place as head of the family could be taken away. It was too late. His hapless daddy would no longer come running to his aid. Lion pulled back the curtain and went inside, saying that he knew he was now responsible for his own safety. His uncle laughed at him and asked what his newfound wisdom said about him showing up here alone. It was stupid to come unless he had an extra life in his pocket. MC told him it was stupid of him to assume he came alone. His uncle became wary and asked what nonsense he was talking about, and at that moment he felt energy radiating from him. He realized that something was wrong. This wasn't just magic, this was dark magic. He remembers this feeling. He feels an abyss far more vast than any mere mortal knows. Beginning to guess, he thought that this simply couldn't be true. Then he looked at the monsters that appeared from this magic and exclaimed, "Are these the living dead?" Lion confirmed this, continuing to summon goblins, and his uncle exclaimed in shock, "How is this possible? Even his late brother couldn't do this." MC asked in bewilderment, "Is something wrong?" The Marbas house had regained control of necromancy. The man clenched his teeth in rage, then ordered the guards to kill this abomination, and they immediately rushed to attack. First of all, they naturally aimed at Lion, but even with a blade flying at his face, he remained calm. His goblin protected him. It appeared in front of the enemy and knocked the sword out of his hands, and he exclaimed in fear that it was resisting. After that, the goblin pounced on him. He swung his sword, dealing him a fatal blow, and he immediately fell to the floor. Kirchall looked in horror at the newly slain guard, while the goblins continued to hack at their master's enemies. Kirchall and the two guards beside him stared in horror at the dead, and then they too rushed into battle. Seeing the splashes of blood and sparks from the blows, Kirchall was shocked, thinking that something was wrong, that this was far beyond the ordinary. He used magic and frowned, thinking that if his eyes were right, the boy had mastered the art of necromancy. But how was that possible? He conjured a magic ball in his hand and glanced nervously at his nephew, then exclaimed, what had he done to create this parody of the founder's power? MC asked in response, is it really so strange that the head of the Marbas clan can control the dead? His uncle shouted that this was nonsense, that the art of necromancy had long been lost. Even his father hadn't managed to use it in life. He wanted him to believe that his useless offspring was any different. He refused to participate in his charade. Lion extended his hand to him and said that he was so stubborn in his refusal to believe it that he left him no choice. He would prove his strength to him, but this was an extremely foolish choice, he warned him. After that, He summoned the dead again, and they roared, and as soon as he gave the command, they rushed into battle. Kerchal grew nervous and, waving his hand, aimed a magic projectile at them and ordered them to retreat. As soon as the cloud of magic touched the goblins' bodies, a bright flash erupted and they were slightly burned. Kerchal looked at them in horror. His attack had failed. The magic blow had only burned half the goblin's face, and this clearly wouldn't stop him from continuing the fight. Magic enveloped the dead man's body. Small lights appeared in his eye sockets, and he rushed toward the man, growling menacingly. He shuddered in fear, then turned to the guards and asked at least one of them to scare the monsters away from him, but his face immediately darkened. They lay on the floor and barely moved, and then he decided to take matters into his own hands. Having created a magic projectile again, he cursed and began shooting at the monsters, thinking that he didn't like to admit it, but his skills in magic were only slightly superior to a beginner's. Moreover, he was limited by the alcohol he had drunk. He told Leon that he would regret such treachery. After this, he would not get off easy. He didn't notice how a goblin approached him from the side. He struck him in the shoulder with his sword, and as soon as he realized this and felt the pain, he let out a hoarse sigh and blood poured out, but despite this, he still did not intend to give up. He created a magic projectile, but unfortunately, he lacked the strength and it shattered. After that, he exclaimed, how dare he go against his own flesh and blood? There is no forgiveness for him. MC said that he recently remembered a treatise on the history of the continent, which he studied with his father. There are victors and vanquished, and hindsight always coldly separates these two concepts with the passage of time. His uncle asked discontentedly, did he dare to lecture him? He said that such an emotionless man as he had yet to comprehend the meaning of that treatise, but if he understood anything from it, it was that forgiveness is the privilege of the victors. He approached him closer with his dead and said that he had once been in the place of a winner. He supposed he considered himself one when he stabbed his father in the back, but times were changing. Kerchal, in a rage, ordered him to close his mouth and immediately saw his reflection in the blade in front of him. Leon said he wouldn't wish him a happy journey. On the contrary, he hoped he would suffer at every step. He promised to cherish this day, the day he had crushed him, and as punishment, he would take away his hope for tomorrow in the name of the head of the Marbas clan himself. He gave the order, and Kerchal could do nothing but stand still and await death. The goblins pounced on him, striking him repeatedly while he screamed in pain. When his screams died down, a pool of blood spread beneath him. They had literally torn him apart. Looking at his body, Marbas noticed that he was downright mad, as he had thought. Even the devil himself would have shed a tear at such a sight. And how could a newly minted necromancer master this power so well on his first try? From the outside, it looks like he's been ruling over the dead for at least 10 years. MC glanced thoughtfully at his uncle's body, then clapped his hands and said with a grin that he just had a funny idea. Marbas smiled awkwardly and asked, funny to the point of shivers? A new day had dawned. He called a meeting, and soon the vassals had gathered in the hall. Only Pullen was absent. One of them asked warily, another meeting at such a time? Does anyone know why Sir Kerchal had summoned them all again? The man replied that he, like them, had no idea. Even his junior assistant hadn't arrived yet, so they could only wait. Another advisor noted that, after all, an urgent council meeting was no joke. What if news was coming of a surprise attack by House Sylvester, and even now, when they were in complete disarray here? The man asked him to stop, but his paranoia was the last thing they needed. He found it hard to believe they would be so audacious as to violate the recent agreement between the two great families. Besides, resuming the war required official approval from His Majesty. The man agreed with him, and said that in any case, they could only wait. All doubts would subside once Sir Kerchal led them. The doors to the council chamber swung open, but it was not the man they were expecting who entered. Lion headed to his seat, and the councillors began to whisper in confusion, not understanding what all this meant, because they thought that Sir Kerchal had arranged the meeting. Why did the young lord come then? Did he decide to challenge Sir Kerchal as the rightful heir? Another vassal said that Kerchal did not care about any formalities, and another agreed with him. Then for what purpose did young Lord Lion come to them? Having reached his seat, MC turned to them and asked if they expected to see his uncle here. Unfortunately, he would not be able to attend this meeting. However, it would be more accurate to say that he was unable to do so. A council member became nervous and asked him to clarify this, and he, taking his seat, announced that he was dead. They looked at him in shock, and he clarified that he had fallen by his hand, after which he looked at them coldly and asked if there were any more questions. The council members looked at him in surprise, and then one of them slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "If what he said is true, sir, he insists on a more detailed explanation. How can he justify killing the most senior member of the Marbas clan council when they had only just mourned his predecessor?" Another council member shouted at him to listen. Even as the head of the clan, he must answer to them. Then the protagonist declared Kerchal was a traitor. Not only had he disowned his father by revealing vital information to their enemy House Sylvester, but he was also planning to usurp his rightful place as the clan's heir. What was clear to him was that, despite the compelling reasons for his immediate execution, they were all zealously trying to defend his honor. The council member paused, but the demand to appear at the meeting clearly came from Sir Kerchal, and still no sign of him, which strongly suggests that he was murdered. But how could the old man allow such a young boy to die? Well, now was not the time to worry about him. The young gentleman had somehow managed to kill Kirchhoff without giving a single order. Then the man rose from his seat and, raising his hand, said, God, he had no idea. He would be damned. How dare he commit such a heinous crime? He thought. So he must have done it with some powerful magic. Another council member looked at him in surprise, then rose from his seat and placing his hand on his chest, declared, he assures him they were not involved. How were they to know that the old swindler was weaving such vile intrigues? After that, the MC tapped his finger on the table and said, silence. He extended his hand forward and said, their claims may not be false, but that does not absolve them of guilt for the grave crime. A crime of negligence in relation to a conspiracy under their roof. The man furrowed his brow and thought, damn, the boy had fooled them all. Then the council member said, okay, my lord, but the question remains, was Sir Kirchhoff truly a traitor? Is there irrefutable proof of his guilt? He certainly wouldn't have killed an innocent man. The protagonist remained silent, then rose from his seat and spoke. They all reacted precisely as someone far more insightful than he had predicted. The man asked, who predicted? Who? If he would allow it? At that moment, Marbus appeared on the protagonist's shoulder, and then he extended his hand forward, focusing his energy, holding a book in his other hand, and said, all right, they asked for proof, didn't they? They must allow him to demonstrate the treachery of Kirchhoff von Marbus. He raised his hand over the book and added, as the legitimate son of the Marbus family, he, Leon von Marbus, calls upon a lost soul. The next second, monsters began to emerge from the ground, heading for the council members. The men were amazed. This was a spell. Summoning the dead. How did he do that? The next second, Kirchhoff's body also appeared from the ground. The council members cried out in surprise. Had he really discovered the forgotten art of their family? Then the MC said, Kirchhoff, will he confess to his crime here and now, before he loses the last of his sanity? The man cried out in surprise. Kirchhoff, how is that possible? The protagonist said he was beginning to tire of this question. What was so shocking about this? When necromancy was the hereditary craft of the Marbus, the man shouted, they must run and save themselves. The council member frowned and shouted, he must burn in hell. Another man ran up to him and, putting a hand on his shoulder, shouted, why are you frozen? He has to move. But the next second, he looked in horror at his comrade, whose head had separated from his body, and then his body collapsed to the ground. Then he turned around and heard, help, someone. The man was crawling on the floor, desperately begging for mercy. A trail of blood was left behind him. He was breathing heavily, and the protagonist said, well, the meeting isn't over yet. They must listen to the head of the family until he has said everything he wants. After that, Kirchhoff opened his mouth, approaching the man, and the protagonist said, he'll ask again, Kirchhoff, is there a single person present who was unaware of his atrocities? He replied, everyone who served the previous head of the house turned against him. Every last one. Not a single one of them was unaware of his duplicity. MC asked, so that's how it is? The man desperately begged for forgiveness. His comrade added that he was ready to repent for his sins. The council member shouted, he must give them a chance to prove his loyalty, my lord, he begs. Then he turned, noticing a monster next to him, followed by loud screams. The protagonist watched what was happening and then said, ouch. He raised his hand and added, by the power granted to him as the head of this family, I, Leon von Marbus, declare to the council that the dark art of necromancy has returned to their glorious line. With these words, he slammed the book shut in his hands. A few moments later, the MC stood in a room full of the bodies of his subordinates, then turned and asked where he should look for Sir Pullen. A worker hiding behind the wall peeked out and said, he fears he's been sent to prison for inciting rebellion. The protagonist asked him to show him the way. He replied, of course, my lord. After this, the protagonist opened the door slightly and said, oh yes, they can flee if they wish, but he can't guarantee the consequences. They should know that. For their own sake, he hoped they would make the right decision. His subordinates looked at him with horror in their eyes. Meanwhile, a subordinate approached Alan and said, Lord. He extended his hand and added, a letter has arrived. He took the letter from his hands and said that he could see it for himself. Then he opened the letter and, after reading the contents, said, excellent. It seems even the Empire has turned its back on House Marbus. The man said, my lord, of course. Aside from the deeds of their ancestors, they have nothing to boast about. Their capital and manpower are simply laughable, to put it mildly. The head of the Sylvester clan added, exactly. They have even less of the former than the latter. One way or another, they will act as planned. They will finally bring House Marbus to its knees as early as next month. Let a noble war break out. And what about the last request? Have you fulfilled it? His subordinate placed his fist to his chest and said that he affirms it without a shadow of a doubt, my lord. He extended his hand and asked, so there's no chance of defeat, right? He replied, unless a full-fledged necromancer suddenly illuminates House Marbus with their presence after a century of mediocrity, or their founder, Wellen von Marbus, rises from the dead in person, their chances of defeat are slim to none. Alan folded his hands in front of him and said, then this war is entirely theirs. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Pullen cried out, young lord. He fell at his feet and screamed, he begs you to forgive his foolish subject, Pullen. He is guilty of allowing Kirchel's dark ambitions to corrupt his soul, thereby putting him in mortal danger. He deserves nothing but death. The protagonist, looking at him, thought, Sir Pullen, one of the few loyal vassals remaining in Marbus's house and the only one who had openly opposed his uncle, must be recruited at any cost. After that, he sat down opposite him and, placing his hands on his, told him he could rise. He was overwhelmed with work, and he needed his help. He asked with tears in his eyes, "His help, Lord? But what good was such a fool?" MC looked at his hand and then told him to bathe first. Then come talk to the chieftain's office. He turned and added, "They'll discuss the details there." He joyfully said that he would be eternally grateful to him, my lord. He, Pullen, here and now swears to serve him with endless devotion. After some time, the protagonist looked out the window. Marbus climbed onto his shoulder and began licking his paw. Then he asked, "So what will he do next?" "The choice is his, contractor." After a while, Pullen shouted in surprise, "He's apologizing?" But even thinking about something so risky was terrifying. Going to meet Sylvester, posing as Kirchhoff. He folded his arms and added that convincingly imitating his behavior would require a fair amount of artistry. After this, the protagonist created a book and, holding his hand forward, asked, "Is that enough?" At that moment, a crow emerged from the ground, taking the form of Kirchhoff. Pullen, looking at him, asked in surprise, "What the hell is this?" He thought, how can the leader remain so steadfast? He'd created a walking corpse out of his own uncle. The other vassals had certainly informed him beforehand, but this, he folded his arms and shouted, "So the rumors about him mastering necromancy are true?" MC replied that he thought so. Pullen reflected that, in the heyday of House Marbus, they could have had everything they desired, so why had the heavens been so cruel to them for so long? He then said he believed that ruling over the dead Kirchhoff would allow him to deceive House Sylvester for a time, my lord. But they would inevitably discover the deception sooner or later. A corpse can't accurately recreate a person's speech, handwriting, or behavior. The protagonist said that would be true if it were Kirchhoff's own corpse, but before him stood the corpse of a doppelganger he'd been lucky enough to encounter. It's a monster capable of copying a person down to their personality, memories, and even abilities. At that moment, Crow extended his hand toward him, creating a clot of energy. Pullen looked at it in surprise and said, "Wow." Not long before, the protagonist had been holding a bloody, cracked sword. He approached the woman's body and asked what this monster was called. Marbus replied, "A doppelganger. It can copy a person down to their personality, memories, and even abilities. This insidious creature likes to copy stragglers, naturally killing the originals in the process, then devours the victim's endless companions." MC asked thoughtfully, "A doppelganger, huh?" Marbus sighed and thought, likely an apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right, Wellen? The next second, the woman's body rose into the air, and he thought how kind it had been of him to leave his faithful henchman for his precious descendant. Then the protagonist turned and asked, "May I?" Marbus replied, "Of course, but he must know that this creature can only copy those the necromancer has personally encountered. A target even more powerful magically cannot be recreated by a doppelganger. Is that understood, contractor? Though talented, he is still too young. Even if he is able to seal his uncle's soul, her loyalty will remain in question if he cannot maintain his grip for the long term. The soul will inevitably dissolve into nothingness. He offers to leave Marbus's house only if he finds a clear way out of his predicament." He replied, "No problem. He will never turn his back on his kind. It is as clear as day what will happen in his absence. The estate's innocent staff will be killed at worst, or subjugated at best by Sylvester's invasion." Marbus asked if he was willing to risk their lives. The protagonist declared that he would gladly accept death for them. Marbus wondered, but why? Just out of some inflated sense of duty to his clan? For what? However, there were more important matters at the moment. After that, he told him to go ahead and turn that bastard into a living corpse. He bet he'd find a use for him. MC asked if he knew this creature. He replied, "Of course, it was one of Welland's favorite puppets. He would be very useful in his current form, but he should know his personality was a bit irritating." After that, the protagonist pointed the book at Crow and spoke. The soul of the dead man manifested within him, the heir of the Marbus clan, Lion von Marbus, calling him back to the world of the living. After that, he took on a more humanoid form, and Marbus, hitting him on the head, shouted, "Wake up already. How long can they lie around doing nothing? They have their first contractor in centuries. What a dumb creature. He needs to change back to his normal form. They don't understand what he's hissing about." He paused, then snapped his fingers and folded his arms across his chest. Then, assuming the form of the protagonist, he looked at Marbus and said, "What kind of pomposity is this for a mangy cat?" Marbus shouted indignantly, "What, do you want to die?" He pointed at him and said he was already dead. What a dumb cat. After that, he and the protagonist exchanged glances. After a while, everyone gathered at the table. Pullen said there was a way to create Kirchel's most minute habits based on his memories. It seemed entirely possible, my lord, to trick Sylvester with his dead shell. Actually, this trick was quite effective. He, Pullen, had to see it with his own eyes, no matter the cost. MC closed his eyes and said, "That's exactly what he wanted to hear, Sir Pullen." He asked, "If I may, my lord, may I ask one last question?" It was obvious Sylvester would seek official permission for another attack on Marbus lands. Why did he seem determined to remain here despite such a threat? Fleeing offered a far better chance of survival. The protagonist recalled his previous words and said that it was his duty as head, after all, to protect the estate. Pullen's eyes widened in surprise and then said, Then he will follow his will with all diligence. Still, he should allow himself to be curious about the reasoning behind this decision. The protagonist responded thoughtfully. Frankly, he had pondered this decision for a long time himself. He clarified. What was he talking about? He confirmed this. He wouldn't dare claim he had any ulterior motives. He simply wanted to become a worthy head of this house. Above all, he wanted to understand what it meant to be worthy. The answer isn't clear yet, to be honest, so he's decided to at least buy himself enough time to get it. Which also means he'll thwart any attempts to take anything from them. As long as he doesn't repeat his father's mistakes and defends what he has, time and time again. He's confident that one day he'll find the answer to why he fights. He's afraid that's all he has on the subject. After some time in the room, Crow folded his arms and said, "Who would have known the house had fallen so low? They have a lot of work to do." Contractor Marbus, who was sitting on the couch, shouted indignantly. To him, he's the master Crow. He shouldn't treat their contractor so disrespectfully. How dare he treat their contractor so disrespectfully? He pointed at himself and asked, "Yes, but Master Marbus himself doesn't seem to care much about formalities." Marbus shouted, "Even so, contractor, isn't he particularly strong in terms of social cues?" He replied that he thought so. And how did he know? He jumped off the bed and said he just smelled it. Anyway, Crow was once Welland's familiar. Basically, he was passed down to him. He was a loyal servant and assassin in his ancestors' service. MC lowered his head and said, "I see." He thought. He believes the ability to transform is quite useful for an assassin's tasks. Crow sighed and said, "Crow, the perfect assassin, will be useful to a contractor, unlike a ragged cat with an inflated ego." Marbus shouted indignantly, "He's not a cat. What does he want? Escort him back to the abyss for his insolence." At this moment, the protagonist thoughtfully said that, to be honest, he really needed his abilities. Crow, could he pretend to be his late Uncle Kirchall? He, tearing Marbus, who had grabbed his head off himself, replied, "Of course it will be, as they say, a piece of snake." Marbus jumped off his head and said, "What an ignoramus. It's a piece of cake, not snake." Then he took off his hat and asked why waste one's palate with human confections when there is a delicious snake venom at hand. The protagonist supposed to each his own, maybe. Marbus chuckled. Humor doesn't work on fools, contractor. The next second, there was a knock on the door. The protagonist asked who it was. Poland entered the room and bowing, said it was him. Lord. He handed the protagonist a letter and said that a letter had arrived from Sylvester and he hastened to deliver it personally. After this, the protagonist unfolded the letter and began to read. It said that for ages now, the House of Marbus has neglected its ducal duty. Isn't it shameful to feast idly, reaping the fruits of the blood and tears of your loyal subjects? House Sylvester, led by Count Alan de Sylvester, challenges House Marbus to a fair fight between noble houses. If the Duchy of Marbus surrenders in a timely manner, there will be no full-scale war, and its people will be welcomed with open arms. If this demand is not met, their army will arrive with a claim within a month, destroying everything in its path. In the name of His Imperial Majesty, and with his wise permission, Count Alan de Sylvester. Marbus, perched on the protagonist's shoulder, read the entire contents of the letter, and said, "And now thunder has struck." The protagonist said, "Wait a month." He asked, "Well, is the suddenness frightening, huh?" "That's right. Time is short. Of course you can flee and postpone the battle. Gather your strength," and MC was surprised. He didn't understand what he meant, but he wasn't sure he could stand a whole month of waiting. After that, he burned the letter in his hands. Marbus said, "But of course they're unbalanced contractor. Their army numbers in the hundreds, if he's not mistaken. This is a completely different scale of threat compared to his uncle. And he still plans to openly confront this?" The protagonist smiled and said he was sure they would be fine. After all, this time there was no need to spare anyone. They could easily take everyone's life. Sometime later, on the shopping street, the man, turning to a comrade, asked if he had heard the news that Sir Kirchall had disappeared overnight. He answered, "Of course. This is a bad sign, considering the previous head of the family had recently passed away." The man said he hoped the young lord was at least okay. The poor boy must be devastated after losing another relative so soon after his father's death. His companion added that he hoped he could weather the coming storm. At that moment, a man next to them asked, "Was he talking about Lord Rune's offspring?" "He shouldn't worry. This one can handle it." The man said that was also true. He didn't think Sylvester would storm the gate anytime soon. The man said, "God willing." At that moment, Pullen approached them and, coughing into his fist, asked, "Gentlemen, must I remind you that a careless word can sink a ship?" The men bowed sharply, and one of them exclaimed, "Sir Pullen." They had merely allowed themselves to exchange news during a break, and nothing more. "He should accept their condolences on his loss, my lord. Such grief." The man bowed lower and added, "To lose an uncle at such a time is very sad. It's hard to even imagine the depth of his suffering." The protagonist replied, "On the contrary, his uncle was very much alive. He had simply suddenly fallen ill with a nasty illness, if they wanted to know. He thought it would be a good idea to create the appearance that his uncle had not died. Then he said that he assures them there was nothing to worry about." He turned around and thought, "If you want to deceive your enemy, first deceive your friends." After that, he said, "Sir Pullen, we should make sure that the surviving vassals do not blab, as well as the other witnesses." He replied, "As he commands, my lord." He can leave it to him. By the way, for what purpose did he visit the city center, my lord? He would get him anything. He only had to order. He replied that he appreciated it, but but there was something he must see for himself. Marbus, sitting on his shoulder, said, "Here it is." He senses a powerful surge of magic in that building. They stopped in front of the building. MC said Sir Pullen, "It would be better for him to wait for him here." He asked in surprise, "My lord, is he sure that he wishes to go alone?" The protagonist walked forward and replied that he was sure. He orders him to seal the door behind him. He is not to allow a single living soul to enter or leave here. Afterwards, he went inside. The building was clearly in disarray, with workers trying to erase the traces. The protagonist, looking at the inhuman ears on one of the men's heads, asked, "Is this the one?" Marbus answered, "Yes, indeed." The man's body was battered. He was kneeling and wiping bodily fluid from the floor. Marbus thought it was a shame to let such incredible talent go to waste. He then said that he believed that there was nothing to be done about the fact that none of his vassals had a keen eye. Afterwards, the protagonist approached him and asked if he could spare him a moment. Walter began to bow and apologize. He was afraid that their establishment had been in disarray last night due to unruly visitors. They would be very grateful if he would stop by another time. The next second, a woman ran up to him, kicked him in the shoulder with her heel, and shouted, "Walter, who speaks to the Lord like that?" Then she placed her hand on her chest and, smiling slightly, asked him to accept her apology, young man. It was an accident that they had to deal with a lowly beastman. After that, she added a slap to his face and shouted, "What an unimaginable mongrel. Does he even understand who he's talking to?" She pointed at the protagonist and said, "This is the young master of the Marbus house himself." Walter fell at his feet again and begged forgiveness. "Madam, he's still new, so he didn't recognize him," MC said. As he said, he wanted to take a minute of his time. The girl placed her hands on her chest and, smiling, said that she would be honored, my lord. She had plenty of that. Before she could finish, the protagonist declared that he wasn't speaking to her. He pointed at Walter and said that he had business with him. He looked at him in surprise, then lowered his gaze and wondered, what did she say? This young man is Lord Marbus? At that moment, the protagonist began to concentrate energy in his hands, and then directed it at Walter. His wounds healed, and the bandages on his neck loosened. He looked at his hands in surprise and asked, "Did he heal his wounds?" MC said, "He was asking for the last time. Will he spare him a minute?" The girl intervened again. She apologized for interrupting, "Young man, but she must inform you that he is her personal slave. He has no right to dispose of his time. Everything the young master needs should be asked of her." He thought, the owner of the establishment was not present when he came for his uncle's soul. Apparently she doesn't know anything, since he got rid of the witnesses. Then he smiled and said, "All right, he will have a couple of questions for her. First, since when has slavery been allowed in the duchy? And second, a lot of time has passed since the death of his predecessor. So why do they continue to treat him improperly? Perhaps she doesn't wish to acknowledge him as the rightful ruler of the Marvus lands?" At that moment, he concentrated his energy around himself, reaching for the book. Marbus, smirking, said, "Well said, his contractor. He may look young, but treating the bearer of a contract with a demon without due respect is extremely impolite. Such things are not forgiven." Then the protagonist said that he was concerned about more than just this beastman. If she had other slaves, he demanded their immediate release. She had 10 minutes to fulfill his will. She should not expect more mercy. She smiled and said, "Well, young master, is he prepared for the consequences?" Oops, had she neglected proper communication again? He replied, "It's all right if she admits her mistake. He had heard worse, after all." Walter looked at the protagonist and asked to what he owed such mercy. He was nothing but an unworthy slave. The next second, the girl snapped her fingers, and the facility's workers armed themselves with improvised materials and were ready to attack. She pointed her hand forward and shouted, "The show's over, guys. Get him. Sir Kirchhoff said he'll cover us if anything happens. Go ahead." They resolutely rushed into the attack. And the next second, MC pointed his hand forward, summoning monsters, which suddenly pounced on the guys. She watched in bewilderment at what was happening. And then the protagonist extended his hand to one of the monsters and asked, "Can I borrow his blade?" His was slightly battered. After that, he took the blade and said, "Great. He'll return it when he's finished." Then he ran up to the man and slit his throat. The girl, perplexed, asked, "What the hell? Where did this little bastard get so much strength?" Then the protagonist, turning slightly, asked, "He's asking what he owes to his grace? He may consider himself an unworthy slave, but that's far from the truth. From now until the end of time, he would be vitally important to him." Walter wondered in surprise. What was he saying? What use would Lord Marbus have for someone like him? He was just a vagabond, hiding in the vastness of the continent. He remembered his past. As a child, he'd fallen into a puddle and screamed, "Enough, it hurts, he's begging." Several children started kicking him and yelling at him to shut his mouth. "You beast." It was parasites like him who were to blame for the poor harvest this year. He shouldn't have been welcomed. What a big beast. Even as a child, he hadn't understood why human children were so cruel to him and why they enjoyed watching him suffer so much. Back then, he'd just been a child who didn't understand how the world worked. But now, he understood everything. Then he rose to his feet and, concentrating his energy around himself, asked the children why they couldn't just leave him alone. He thought they had no rational reason to make his life hell, other than species differences. He screamed, Why are they doing this? He thought that's the only reason he became the object of their hatred. One day, he suddenly realized he'd been too naive to understand earlier. Moments later, he stood next to the children's bodies and desperately asked, "What have I done?" He thought he couldn't bring himself to accept it at first, afraid to face the truth, that he was the heartless monster they thought he was. In the present, the protagonist returned the weapon to the monster. The girls screamed in fear. What is he doing? He thought his teenage rebellion would force Kirchel to renounce his title. A useless lord's offspring can't stop anyone. He had to remember that. He said her words were even truer than she thought. But could she see that he had no intention of remaining a useless lord's offspring who didn't even try to protest in the face of injustice? He concentrated energy in front of his hand and said that he would soon become the head of the family, worthy of the proud house of Marbas, and that there was no place for her on his land. She shouted, "Arrogant bastard." After that, the protagonist turned to Walter. He looked at him in response, wondering if he might be a murderer, his hands stained with blood. But for some reason he felt no fear of him at all. Why? After that, the protagonist smiled and asked, "Walter, then? He doesn't wish to join him? His skills would be useful." He replied, "He shouldn't consider this impudent, my lord, but could he perhaps ask one more question before swearing allegiance?" He concentrated energy around himself. His face changed slightly, and he said that he was a descendant of demonic wolves, the most reviled species even by beastman standards, and would they treat him with contempt for the rest of his days? How much longer must he and his tribe endure such taunts like wild animals? MC replied, "Not a second longer," he assures him. He knew little of the state of his kind, nor of the machinations surrounding it. However, if his life was burdened by baseless prejudices, he must make it known, and from now on, he will no longer have to endure them. He will become a full vassal of House Marbas. He gives his word. These words brought tears to Walter's eyes. He openly burst into tears, then placed his hand in the protagonist's. He asked if he should take his silence for consent. Walter lowered his head and confirmed, "My lord, he will be happy to serve you." After a while, Esteban von Archheim sat on the throne. Beside him stood Louis von Archheim, the crown prince of the empire. Then he said, "Vassal of Eldoras, why have you requested an audience?" He knelt, lowered his head, and said that a letter had arrived from the noble house of Sylvester, his highness. The prince said that as prince regent, he was responsible for the affairs of the people and the duchy. Should he really be dealing with the count's problems as well? His dear father would have been so displeased. He shouted, and never thought of it. His highness? He was only rushing to share the good news. He must forgive his servant, his highness. Louis asked, "Good news then?" Eldoras thought, at the moment, it was the crown prince who wielded power in the empire. He could not afford to fall from grace. Then Louis said, "Indeed, House Marbas he speaks of?" He confirmed it, his highness, the object of his deepest contempt all these years. One of the three kinds of darkness. He was inviting him to take this opportunity to support House Sylvester to get rid of their common enemy once and for all. He replied, "An interesting proposition, I must admit. But one mustn't forget that the Marbas family possesses the power of necromancy, right? Open war against them could backfire, to say the least." Eldoras remarked that he was as insightful as ever, your highness. However, the Marbas family lacked a worthy successor to this power. The Sylvester family, however, had grown so powerful that they could easily rival the Marbas. He replied, "Very well then." He could carry out his plan. Now was the perfect time to get rid of these grave robbers. He shouted, "By the great Archheim Empire, he would surely succeed in this mission." Afterwards, he left the hall. Louis, looking at the emperor, said he was grateful for his magnanimous decree, father. He would finally be rid of this thorn, a relic of a bygone era. Long live the emperor, his legacy is in good hands. He placed his hand on the emperor's shoulder and said that everything would come to him very soon, and he would dispose of it as he saw fit. Meanwhile, in the protagonist's office, Pullen placed the necklace on Walter and said that the common people still didn't particularly trust the beastmen. He suggested that they keep this artifact with them for now. His lordship and he, of course, valued him highly as a loyal vassal, but he feared they could not yet disregard public opinion. The next second, Walter's ears disappeared from his head, and Pullen raised his index finger and added, "So they will not cause his lordship any unnecessary problems, okay?" He answered, "As he says, Sir Pullen." He nodded and said, "Excellent. What a quick-witted young man." After that, the protagonist said that if they were finished, he wanted to speak with them about a couple of important matters, so to speak. First of all, he must insist that they swear an oath of loyalty that is more than just words. So they must let him ask if they are ready to devote all their endless devotion to him and him alone. Pullen cried out with tears in his eyes, "Absolutely, my lord." He took his hand and added, "He, Pullen, swears to dedicate his entire life to him, to serve House Marbas faithfully and truly until the end of his days. He begs him to give this worthless vassal a chance to fulfill his duty, Lord." Crow, folding his arms, said, "New lord, he is impressed. he has so thoroughly won over the old man. Marbas added, indeed, submission and dominance are the key principles of House Marbas. Then Walter said, he shares his feelings, my lord. The protagonist folded his arms and said that these are their principles, not his. Walter asked, young lord, who is he speaking to now? He replied, in short, to be serious, he is proposing a contract sealed with mana. If they refuse the agreement, he would consider it a lack of sincere desire to join him. Walter clarified, a contract sealed with mana? A contract sealed with mana, or rather a pact. It transforms the mana of each party into a pattern that binds and intertwines the destinies of both with an unbreakable bond, allowing them to share secrets that can only be taken to the grave. After this, MC rose from his seat and, approaching them, said that if there were no objections, they would begin. He then extended his hand forward, and hands emerged from the ground holding a scroll. The scroll then opened before his subordinates, and Marbas appeared in the form of a lion. He declared that as the patron of the Marbas house and the demon who lent that name to their lineage, he would witness this magical pact and allow all who swore to serve his contractor to bind their souls with Marbas's power. So be it, they shall see. The Lord of the Living Dead has returned. Powerful energy exploded in all directions. Then the protagonist said he thought enough of the drama. They were his loyal followers, and they should be treated with respect. Marbas said, okay, let's say the agreement is made. They must remember that the price for breaking it is their very souls, and that no betrayal will go unpunished. Pullen bowed and said he had no intention of such blasphemy. He wondered if this could really be the real Marbas, the demon with whom the founder had made a contract. However, that would explain how young Lord Lion had acquired the power of necromancy. Walter, also bowing, was surprised by the overwhelming concentration of mana. His species is naturally sensitive to mana, but he was simply paralyzed, begging the question, who exactly is Lord Lion? Just like that menacing black lion. The next second, Marbas transformed into a smaller version. Walter cried out in surprise, such a cute cat? Pullen immediately covered his mouth. The demon asked what he had said about him. Pullen laughed awkwardly and said that he was simply amazed by his impressive appearance and formidable presence. Lord Marbas. He was sure that young Walter had never seen such an impressive sight. He asked, is that so? Well, fine, but they must remember, they must not divulge his existence to other mortals. Mistakes are unacceptable. They are at war, and knowledge here can determine life or death. His appearance is visible only to those to whom he has revealed himself. As he understands, the so-called aristocracy of their world is quite interested. What was his name again? Kirchall, right? Pullen clarified, Kirchall? Walter uttered the name and then added, he recalls, the mistress once received a letter, or she was supposed to convey it to Lord Kirchall. Marbas said, then here's their next target. MC asked where they could find this letter. He replied, from what I know, my lord. Before he could finish speaking, Crow entered the conversation and said that he knew where it was. He took out a chest and said, what idiots they are. How could they forget to pick up the spoils of war? Marbas put his paw to his head and said that he had forgotten how petty this little soul was. Considering that he had destroyed the entire building and eliminated its owner, he apparently decided that he could get his hands on everything that wasn't nailed down. After that, the protagonist approached the chest and, opening it, saw a multitude of precious stones, among which was a letter. He took it out and said, here it is, gentlemen. Marbas said, it seems he can be useful sometimes. Crow asked, puzzled, is that a compliment? A compliment, right? After this, MC unfolded the letter and said he would read it aloud. Hear this, enemies of House Marbas. The noble House of Sylvester hereby declares that, following the will of His Majesty the Emperor, territorial war has been declared against their duchy. Despite the formidable power bestowed by the title of Duke, they have neglected their duty to His Majesty, Emperor Louis. This neglect of duty is a grave crime, and he will hold them accountable in the name of the crown. They have 1 month. If they raise white flags and surrender, they will revoke their declaration of war, and House Marbas will be completely absorbed into House Sylvester as punishment for their sins. If they choose to resist, they will have to defend their innocence in fair combat. Lord of House Sylvester, Alan D. Sylvester. Then he said, 1 month. Marbas asked, is that not enough? The protagonist looked at him and said he didn't care about time, but he had a funny idea. Now that he could control the undead with his mind, a whole new world of fun had opened up. Sir Crow. He looked at him in surprise, and the protagonist said he had a separate mission for him. After a while, the subordinate approached Alan and said, the declaration of war has been successfully delivered to House Marbas, my lord. He should have seen the face of that idiot Kirchall. He practically hung on him, looking pathetic. He almost put him out of his misery right there. The head of the house laughed and said, that idiot, he's probably having a fit. But they need to keep him alive for now. He's a useful idiot. Let the power of the Marbas family rest in his clumsy hands for now. Speaking of which, what about the boy? He knows, the rightful heir. The man asked, was it about Lion? No significant news about him. Perhaps Kirchall has already buried him somewhere. He said, excellent. The subordinate added, if I may, lord, why bother with a 14-year-old boy? What can a mere child do? He replied that he should tell him this. What, in his opinion, is the most unfair thing that can happen to a man? He replied that he was no scholar. Such wisdom was unknown to him. He said he would face an overwhelmingly powerful enemy against whom he had no chance. Resistance was futile. and he could only watch as his world of suffering mercilessly crumbled. There's no suffering more terrible than this, and what could be the cause of such injustice? Only innate talent, a talent so incredible that it makes you tremble just by looking at it. The subordinate asked, "Does he mean to say that a worthless person can possess this, my lord?" He replied that he must not be a fool. They are, after all, talking about a descendant of Wellen. Given one's bloodline, one can never be sure of anything. One must always consider the probabilities. He replied, "Yes, my lord." After a while, the protagonist looked at Crow, who had assumed his form, and said, "He must say, quite a sight." He replied, "Ah, impressive, isn't it?" The protagonist noted that human speech sounded wild in his true form, but now having absorbed his memories, he imitated him with incredible accuracy. He replied that he himself saw, my lord, that he could offer more than a modicum of magical power, unlike a single plush toy. Marvis, enraged, began scratching him and shouted, "You dirty worm!" Walter, watching the scene, asked in surprise, "Is it always so noisy here, Schipulin?" He responded by telling him to be quiet. "Young Walter, he'll live longer." After this, Lion took the sword hanging on the wall and asked if it was time for them to begin. They only had a month left. All he asked was for them to demonstrate their talents during this time. Walter took the sword and asked, in other words, if his talents were not put to use, he was of no help in his plan, right? He agreed and said that what good was a vassal who would easily die? The choice was his. He said with a serious expression that he was ready to overcome any obstacle in his path to gain his rightful place at his side. If he lived up to the title of his most skilled soldier, could he fulfill one wish for him? He said with a calm expression that of course he promised to do so. Pullen began to cough to get his attention and said that in that case, they should find him suitable combat training. The limits of his abilities would immediately become apparent if he trained with the worthy knights of House Marbus. He agreed with him and said that so be it. Marbus jumped on his shoulder and said that it was time for them to go too. The wolf wasn't the only one who needed training. He was just as far from his true potential as he was. The protagonist started to leave, agreed and said that it was time for them to go then. Sometime later, Walter was practicing sword fighting against several skeletons he had summoned. He lunged forward and, with sharp blows of his sword, won. He was breathing heavily after this training, approached him and knelt down. He looked at him with a small smile and said that he was welcome to the House of Marbus. From now on, he was the vanguard knight of his army. He stood before him with a satisfied smile and closed his eyes. Sometime later, when the day of the declared war between the noble houses arrived, Alan, along with his army, galloped to his castle and loudly announced that he had a message for the current head of the Marbus family. Despite his favorable offer of a peaceful solution, they stubbornly refused to listen to common sense and lay down their arms. They must know that their foolish decision will result in not only their own deaths, but also the deaths of their innocent subordinates. He looked at him from the castle wall with a calm expression and said that this is where it began. Pullen, with a displeased look, called them jackals and asked if they had any sense of honor. Marbus said that they should not fall for provocation. Personally, he could clearly see the fear that had settled in the depths of their hearts. Their menacing cries were only a reflection of doubts. He stood nearby and asked, does he mean that in the depths of their hearts they are afraid? However, House Sylvester has the advantage on all fronts. He sat on MC's shoulder and said that this was not the case. They must not forget that they exposed their plans. He looked at him and asked, was he probably talking about the late Kirchhoff? Indeed, if he were still alive, House Marbus would simply raise the white flag at the first demand. So, his death alone shook their composure? He said with a grin. Mortals are such fragile creatures. Any fluctuations in events often give rise to endless confusion. Why hasn't the enemy surrendered yet? Do they have some kind of trump card that makes them so confident? The moment these doubts begin to overcome them, even a steady hand can waver in battle. Pullen said that he must admit that these were the right words. However, even trembling hands can be overwhelming. Marbus chuckled and said that his honored contractor would overcome the full force of this army. They need not worry. Their lord is much stronger than it may seem. He agreed with this, and he thought that it was true. Even he was amazed by his absolute talent. Earlier, they both summoned a group of walking dead, but Lion's warriors easily defeated those he summoned. He looked at him and thought that, although these were the weakest walking dead a necromancer could summon, it had barely been a week since he had learned to control his magical power. Yet he was already able to read the flows of mana with his eyes closed. Truly, the depth of his talent was astounding. Crow stood nearby and said that the current contractor was truly a gift. Like a rising star, the infamous founder. Marbus said that he was capable of once again drowning the continent in blood. That was for sure. The time would come and he would get everything he wanted. He asked, even those delicious peanuts that he loved so much, would there be enough of them? He smirked and told the idiot that he should aim higher. He was capable of attaining the most forbidden dark magic, the terrifying power of reversing time. After that, he opened his eyes, walked up to him, and said that everything was ready. What kind of training would they do now? He turned back and said that first, they needed to move. They teleported into the office, and he said something about the next skill he would master. How much did he know about dark magic? The protagonist, with a calm expression, said he knew a little. He had studied it as part of the basic curriculum for their kind. Marbus asked, was he talking about that piece of junk his uncle had thrown around? He should forget that pathetic parody. He looked up thoughtfully and said that it seemed a lot depended on the individual. Considering the speed with which their founder, Wellen, conquered the eastern continent, it would be easy to assume that only the Walking Dead helped him. Crow transformed into him, snapped his fingers, created a cloud of dark energy, and said that, at its core, necromancy was just one branch of dark magic. This meant that it was their supply of dark mana and their mastery that determined the might of the army of the dead. Pullen, with a cheerful expression, said that these words were addressed to the founder and to them, his loyal followers. Mukar looked at him seriously and asked, "Does it count?" He wasn't his follower, they were friends. To be clear, equals who always fought shoulder to shoulder, unlike that foolish Mordosman, I should point out. He smirked and said that, on the contrary, he was proud of his loyalty. He said, with a slightly disgruntled expression, that he was only good at being sarcastic, hiding behind the guise of a contractor. Crow asked not to be ridiculous, and asked who would hide from a kitten. MC, with a calm expression, said he'd had enough of their barbs. It would be better to show them the spells they wanted to teach him. Marbus said that before learning, he would have to fulfill one prerequisite. However, he should know that this would require risking a descent into his own subconscious. If he didn't know, the hidden depths of his mind are a kind of vessel containing vast reserves of magical power. Once he learned to control this unbridled energy, noble war would seem like a sandbox compared to what he would become capable of. However, he must note, dark magic requires a large expenditure of mana. He said with a calm expression that he thought so. He looked at him and said that nevertheless, he had no reason to worry. He was curious to know why. It was because he may or may not believe it, but he sensed a reserve of mana within him equal to, if not exceeding, his ancestor. He thought that, although it was still unclear whether this was good or bad, he had no choice but to take the risk if he wanted to restore his lineage to its former glory. He said that he could not say that this process was without risk. There was only one way to learn to draw mana from his hidden reserve, their compressed timeframe. However, even he could not guarantee its safety. Lyon looked at him calmly and asked, what kind of miraculous method was this? He thought with a small smile that it seemed like a light was flickering in his lifeless eyes again. Looking back, it becomes clear that in his youth, he was driven by only one desire, an uncontrollable curiosity. He said that first, he needed to deplete his mana reserves to the limit. Then it was up to his subconscious and potential. This would guide him. He began to release a huge amount of energy around himself, and he looked at it and thought that a primitive thirst for power was the greatest motivation. He was a little tired from spending so much energy and said that it seemed like this should be enough. He lost consciousness, but Pullen caught him, began to cry, and said loudly that he could not leave them so soon. Marbus hit him on the head with his paw and told this idiot that he should not touch the boy. He should show at least a little faith in his leader. He continued to cry and said that, although the Lord is their leader, as he said, he is still too young. Crow looked at him and asked if he did not hear what he was told. Their contractor may turn out to be the most gifted of their predecessors. He said calmly that he was finally saying the right things. Considering that he could compete with Wellen in terms of potential, he was confident that everything would be fine with him, so he should save the tears for another time. At that moment, Walter entered the office and loudly declared that he had done it, that it was a complete success. They must see their new sword master. He was very surprised by what he saw there and loudly called out to the young master. He ran up to him with tears in his eyes and loudly declared that he could not do this. Pullen said that he should calm down. He had already made a fool of himself for both of them. He agreed and said that no matter what, he believed that the master would overcome everything. Marbus grinned and thought that mortals were all the same. How did it happen that such an incredible talent had been hidden all these years? No wonder the family almost died out. At the same time, the protagonist found himself in a dark space, where he began to wander and look around. After that, he saw the ruined streets of the castle, where a man with black hair stood. He called him by name with a smile, and said that he was welcome. He had a premonition that he would look in. He turned to him and asked if he minded taking a walk. They had so much to discuss, after all. He looked at him with a slightly surprised expression and called him father. They reached the stairs, where Rune stopped, called him by name, and said that since he had come, it meant he had decided to awaken the magical power dormant within him. He agreed and said that he definitely didn't do it to tell him how well he was doing. However, he had a circle of loyal subjects for whom he was responsible, and he wanted them to succeed. He told his son with a smile that he was lucky, as he must have already realized it was a figment of his imagination. He met his end at the hands of Alan, so this form was just a magical echo or something like that. It just happened that way because of an innate lack of potential. Doesn't he think this fate is cruel? However, what difference does it make now? He can still be useful to him. He already knows that he was unable to secure the support of Lord Marbus, just as he failed to master the Necronomicon, the sacred relic of their lineage. However, he must take a different path. While he was alive, he developed a spell capable of converting all the particles of ancestral mana into his magical reserve. Naturally, he would initially only be able to partially control such a reservoir. However, it would undoubtedly help him strengthen his position as leader. MC looked at him and said that he personally remembered how he once said that accepting someone else's mana as his own was very dangerous. He had clearly told him that there was a risk of it spiraling out of control, simultaneously destroying the caster's mind. Rune said that he seemed to be listening carefully. Magical energy is marked by its owner, so it is not so easily given to another sorcerer. However, he is an exception. For now, he will not be able to understand much, but for now, he must simply imagine that he is a blank slate. Lord Wellen von Marbus, the founder of their lineage, was the only one who possessed dark mana of perfect purity. He began to concentrate a ball of dark energy and said that he was blessed with this great gift of their lineage. This ball of energy began to destroy all the buildings around them. He told his son with a serious expression that he is who he is. However, he must understand, the ball of energy grew to enormous proportions and it hovered above their heads. Rune stroked his head and said that it seemed the time of their meeting had come to an end. Lion looked at him and asked if they would meet again. Rune agreed and said that as a father, he still had so much to teach him. He compressed the ball of energy and directed it towards him. He was surprised by this and said that he had never felt such impressive magical power. An amulet appeared on his neck and his father said that it was called greed. As the name suggests, it is capable of consuming everything in its path in an instant. He must not forget this. He promised to remember this. The area around them began to crumble, and his father said that they would meet again when his heart desired it most. He bowed to him and said that he would pray for this day to come soon. He disappeared, and Rune said with a smile that if fate decreed it, he would shine like a never-before-seen rising star. It was a pity that he would never see it again. No one knows where this power will lead him, to the rays of glory or to the abyss of destruction. In the depths of his fears, the thought lives that this might be his last. In the real world, the protagonist lay in bed and his subjects stood around him and waited. Polan asked with a worried look, were they sure he would wake up again? He questioned his insight. He should not think about it. It's just that the young master had barely turned 14. What if this affliction had consequences? How will he then look into the eyes of the previous head of the family in the afterlife? Marbus said that if the young lord failed such a simple test, the moment of their reunion would come sooner than he could imagine. He should cast aside his pitiful doubts and await his return with hope. Walter agreed with him and said that His Excellency would definitely cope. He dared to assure him that there was no need to worry. Crow agreed and said that the old servant was overreacting. Dark energy began to emanate from him, and Marbus, smiling, said that now it was clear why he had been so late. Walter looked at it with slight surprise and asked what kind of magical power it was. Such thick and dense clouds of mana. He jumped onto his torso and said that he was already on his way to them. They should try to greet their lord properly. They must be vigilant. He will return completely different from the young boy they remembered. Unexpectedly, he opened his eyes. He looked down and said that he just thought he was putting so much pressure on him. Could he please move? After that, they began practicing again, improving their abilities. 4 days before the war in House Sylvester, between the noble houses, many knights gathered in the square. Alan rose from his throne and said that the time had come. They must heed great warriors of House Sylvester. Very soon, the centuries-old history of the once proud Marbus family will forever sink into oblivion. However, they will write a new history with them. They must follow him. Kirchall stood among them, and with a serious expression on his face, began to use his energy. After some time, he rode on a horse with his army and asked with a grin, "Can you find a weakness in their formation of a handful of soldiers?" His insight deserves praise, and he is grateful for it. He laughed, reciprocated, and said that this is the least he can offer in exchange for his generosity. Alan said that, although something still surprised him, he thought that these sentimental Marbus would guard the graves of their ancestors more zealously. It was even more foolish of them to place their forces in such an open space. Kirchall said that this was the home of necromancers, not strategists. After all, he was inclined to think that they were careful not to destroy the burial places of their ancestors. He said with a serious expression that their greatness had long been trampled into the mud. However, they still desperately floundered to maintain their former reputation. He agreed with this, and he asked why he hesitated. Did he have something to say? He declined and said that he proposed to continue. They noticed a detachment moving in their direction, and when they approached each other, they saw MC. He said with a small smile that everything was as agreed. He was glad to see that he was keeping his word. Alan said with a grin that he had come to examine the weaknesses of the fallen house. However, he was met by 100 heavily armed soldiers. He abruptly struck Kirchall in the neck with his sword and asked, "I suppose this was a performance in his honor, wasn't it?" His head began to fall, and he said that only the master has the right to attack him with a sword. His head returned to its place with the help of magic, and he said with a smile that although he must admit this was an original experience, he was surprised by what happened, and said that he had definitely hit his neck. With a serious expression, he loudly called out to the head of the Marbus clan, and said that it didn't matter. He would answer in full for his insolence. He didn't think he could defeat him with a pitiful handful of soldiers, did he? This insulted the majesty of the Sylvester clan. Lion looked at him with a smirk and said that this was not the case at all. After all, to deserve the insult, he first had to pose a threat. He began to drip dark energy onto the ground and asked, why else would he agree to this fight, only to put him in his place? When his energy fell to the ground, Armored skeletons began to emerge. Alan was surprised by what he saw and asked worriedly, "Is this necromancy?" He calmly told this lord that he was getting to the root of the matter. His words sounded as if he was surprised to encounter necromancy, a will against a necromancer. The warriors he summoned began to fight against the Sylvester army, who were trying to fight back. One of them looked at the protagonist and thought that, whatever the case, the enemy was just a boy. No matter how much talent he had, he was still too young and not ready for a brutal fight to the death. He broke through the crowd of monsters and swung his sword to attack. He was very surprised when Walter stood in front of him and blocked his blow. With a displeased expression, he loudly asked who dared to stand in his way. With a serious expression, he pointed his sword at him and said that he asked not to blame him, but he would not let him near the young master. This was his duty, and he would not back down from it. At the same time, the summoned warriors began to push back the enemy army. Alan, looking worried, loudly called out to a squad of mages and said that they must join the battle. They used their magic and struck lightning into the crowd of summoned creatures. With a serious expression, he raised his sword, loudly called out to the vanguard knights and said that they would storm them all together. He galloped to the attack and began to defeat the living dead. He said with a serious expression that he must make it clear that he is a ruthless man by nature. Be it his older brother, the legitimate heir to the headship, or his older sister, he never thought of them as kindred spirits. MC asked with a calm expression if he thought he cared about his family drama. Alan said with a serious expression that maybe not, but the only scion of a lord who had everything served on a silver platter his whole life would hardly be able to match his courage. He raised his sword above his head and said that the young head of the family must answer him one question. Does he thirst for revenge? However, he will die here in vain, filled with nothing but regret. He calmly stood before him and said that he was wrong about two things. He took out the Necronomicon and said that he must allow him to explain. First, he's not tempted by revenge, and second, he simply doesn't have the strength to take his life. That's all he wanted to say. A few days ago, Lion and his subjects were sitting in a tent, looking at a map. Marbas said that over the centuries of his existence he'd seen worse tricks, but this one was too risky. Choosing this area as the operation zone wasn't a bad idea, but that's all there is to it. He sat calmly in front of him and said that he assured him there simply couldn't be a better plan. It would be foolish if, in pursuit of caution, they made an irreparable mistake when the optimal solution was right under their noses. Crow said that he believed in the master's plan. What right does a ball of fur have to give advice? Walter, looking a little worried, said that he also supported the master's plan. It wasn't that he didn't respect the wisdom of the overlord, of course. Marbas agreed and asked, they all just didn't care what he thought, did they? Pullen said that he, for his part, pledged to mobilize all available forces. As his loyal vassal, he could not leave him alone on the battlefield. The protagonist agreed and said that since they had decided everything, he proposed to begin. He called the overlord and said that before they began, he asked permission to ask one question. He pointed to his amulet and asked if he knew anything about the negative consequences of using it. He looked at it and asked how he would know, probably death. Crow leaned towards him and said that he was such a pessimistic ball of wool. He ignored him and said that his father had not revealed the whole truth to him, but this amulet contained a power akin to poison. It was hard to bear, at least in his current state. He looked at him with a calm expression and asked, nevertheless, did he want him to get it for some specific purpose? Marbas said that he would not deny it, but that it was in the future. For now, he is powerful enough for his purposes. The gift he received is too outstanding for an ordinary vessel. However, his potential is a fruit that has yet to ripen. Also, his followers may be loyal to him, but the mortals are not without flaws. Since he is a mortal himself, he surely understands what might be on their minds. At any moment, they can turn against him, as happened with his father. However, what makes him believe that these mortals are worth risking everything for? Currently, he opened the Necronomicon, from which dark energy emanated. Alan looked at him with a serious expression and asked, does he think he is not capable of taking his life? MC looked at him with a serious expression and released a large amount of energy. He thought with a shocked look that it was mana the color of the blackest night with an aura of pure darkness. He also uses it with incredible precision and caution. Where did he get such control skills? He looked at him with a serious expression and said that the loyal servants of the Marbas family wandering the afterlife must heed him. Alan looked at him with a worried expression and thought that his instinct was screaming that whatever performance he was starting, he must interrupt it at any cost. He turned to his soldiers and loudly declared that they could not allow him to complete the spell. He ignored this and said that the true heir of the Marbas family was calling them to arms. He asked them to answer his call and fulfill their duty under his banner. Immediately after this, many warriors began to emerge from underground. Marbas watched from afar and said that he swears by the abyss that this guy is as wild and unruly as his predecessor, Wellen. At that moment, the summoned soldiers attacked the shocked soldiers. One of the very powerful monsters destroyed several soldiers with one blow, and others from the side began to use their magic. Alan was worried about this and said loudly that it was a trap. He had deliberately lured them to the cemetery. An entire army of the dead serves him. His attention was drawn to Leon, grabbing his amulet and starting to cough up blood. He said loudly that he must stop immediately because he was risking his life now. He swears to spare him along with his subjects. He must end this senseless. He didn't have time to finish because he said it was a pity to disappoint him. He remembered what Marbas had asked earlier, but what made him believe that these mortals deserved to risk everything. He would prefer that he refrain from unnecessary risks for the sake of some people until his talent was fully strengthened. He has yet to gain the power that would allow him to spare others, much less save their lives. He called the Lord and asked if he could tell him why they had to wait for the fruit to ripen before picking it. They could pick it first, and then let it ripen. By now, Alan's army had been defeated and he was kneeling before the protagonist. He asked if he was saying that his goal wasn't revenge at all. Having received a positive answer, he grabbed the hem of his robe and asked if he could then ask for mercy, even though he didn't deserve it. He swears that they will never again stand in the way of the House of Marbas, that he will not spread word of his power throughout the empire. He looked at him and asked in a serious voice when they had become so close that they could ask for such mercy. He raised his head and said loudly that, however, he himself knows that revenge only breeds a vicious circle of hatred. They looked at each other, after which he said loudly that he assures them that he was forced to do so. He must understand him, as a fellow lord of a noble house. It is their duty to do everything necessary for its prosperity. He looked away with a puzzled expression and said that perhaps there was some truth in his words. The burden of responsibility of the head of the family is very heavy. Alan, with a frightened expression on his face, loudly agreed, and said that under its monstrous oppression, he did not dare to rush about and was forced to resort to these atrocities. MC looked at him with a serious expression and said that nevertheless, he did not see a single reason in all this to spare him. He must not misunderstand him. This was not out of personal grudges. He would take his life based solely on the cold calculation that his continued existence was of no benefit to the House of Marbas. He looked at him with a displeased expression, loudly called him an arrogant freak, and said that he would regret it, but it would be too late. The power he so carelessly used was not child's play. He didn't have time to finish because he cut off his head with one blow of his sword. He recalled the army he had summoned, felt very tired, and said that he understood this without it. He began to fall, but a worried Valter caught him. Marbas came to them and said that he needn't worry. This is the most common depletion of mana. He thought that the young master's talent was certainly not inferior to that of his ancestor. Only one question arises. Is the boy up to such enormous potential? A monster is growing inside him that even he is unable to tame. It's a risky deal in exchange for every ounce of his being. He said they needed to get back to business. It seemed demons were actively interfering in the human world, which was a bad sign. After some time, Pullen said loudly in the room that their master had finally come to his senses. He was asking for forgiveness for failing him. He had to throw him in prison. That was the only way he could atone. Marbas chuckled and said no one would dissuade him. It would be a marvelous sight. Crow said he was absolutely charming, the stupid ball of fur completely devoid of empathy. He got angry at this and asked, "He's a demon. What kind of empathy are we even talking about? He shouldn't think he'd tolerate his vile insults for long." Lion sat up and said there was no need for prison. He'd done his job perfectly, he assured him of that. Valter said that after the loss of their leader, Sylvester would be on the brink of collapse. He believed there was no need to worry about another invasion anytime soon. Pullen loudly agreed and said that under his wise leadership, Marbas would get back on his feet. However, he was afraid that a new problem was looming. He looked at him with a calm expression and asked what kind of problem that was. He said that he himself was ashamed to say it, but their house was almost completely ruined. Frankly, he had a significant debt in his name. Marbas asked what the problem was. Wouldn't it be solved by demanding reparations from House Sylvester? He said that normally that would be the case. However, the ruling family had banned any reparations demands from them by royal decree. He became indignant about this and asked why on earth that was the case. He said that, as they probably know, the noble houses of Rheinhofer, Soder, and Marbas are associated with the dark forces, so the imperial family is trying to keep them in check. It is quite possible that the imperial family will simply refuse any request for compensation to prevent them from rising. He sighed with displeasure and said that it was a complete mess, both inside and out. The protagonist asked how much the debt was currently. Pullen showed 5 fingers, and he asked hopefully, 5,000 gold coins. He shook his head a couple of times in refusal, and said with a worried look that it couldn't be 500,000, such a sum was almost impossible to pay. He told my lord that, unfortunately he was right. The total debt of their house was 500,000 gold coins. At that moment, Richel de Flamel, the senior acolyte of the prestigious Mage Tower and the founder of the Eremit School, said that he had finally reached the lands of Marbas. Carleen, the head of the southern branch of the Sleeper Criminal Organization, a ruthless loan shark, came to him and said she was glad to see him. He looked at her and said he was sure his school's debt to her had long been repaid. She asked with a smirk, Did he seriously think she would come all this way for this? He shouldn't be afraid. After all, he wasn't her debtor. He apologized and said he hadn't yet fully recovered from the consequences of interacting with debt collectors. However, in those days, the very existence of the magic tower was at stake. She said with a smile that that's why they strongly recommend clients read the fine print. He turned away and said that was enough talk. He believed they wished to meet the same person. Sometime later, when Pullen told them about the amount of the debt, there was a knock on their door. He turned to them and said that he would go see who it was. MC felt a strange energy that worried him. Marvis noticed it and asked what was the matter. He said that he hoped that nothing unusual happened. He returned to them, called my lord, and said that they had guests. He asked with a slightly worried look how many there were. He said that there were 2 of them, a man and a woman. After that, they went into the study. Rochelle began to drink tea and said that he was grateful for the hospitality. He stated his name and said that he was the head of the Eremit school. Carlene stated her name and said that she was the head of the southern branch of the Sleeping Ones. Lion, with a calm expression, said welcome to Marbus's house. They both looked at him silently with small smiles. Walter said that each of them was a threat in their own way. Is he sure this is a good idea? Crow said that their lord was stronger than he seemed. There was nothing to fear. He would prevail. She said with a smile that they had recently heard rumors of their victory in the territorial battle. She dared to congratulate him on his victory. She hoped that the spoils of war were enough to pay off the debt to the sleepers, didn't she? He asked with a worried look. Since it had come up, how much exactly did they owe her? Pullen leaned towards him and quietly said that he asked to take into account that at the time of the loan, their family had an outrageously low standing with the creditors. The bulk of their debt would have to be repaid to her. He looked at her and thought that she, the head of the southern branch of the Sleeper organization, probably one of the largest criminal groups on the continent. These are the worst loan sharks they could have come across. He said that if a borrower defaulted on their payments, they were sold to black magicians for experiments. Carlene said with a smile that he was so familiar with the intricacies of their work. She was flattered. Then they could not drag it out and get straight to the point. He said that he was once again forced to request the current payment amount. She suddenly became serious, took out a list and said that she was afraid they were forced to insist on an immediate payment of at least 10%. After that, he could pay the remaining 90% as he pleased. However, she asked him to keep in mind the 30% annual interest on the principal amount. Therefore, she recommended paying it off as soon as possible. He wondered where he could get 400,000 gold pieces at once. With 30% annual interest, even that money would not be enough. The debt increased by 120,000 each year. He asked who could have signed such an absurd contract. Pullen stood behind him and said it was his father. Rachel called her by name and said that she should not press so hard. She should let the Lord at least savor his victory for a little while. He seriously doubted that he had such an unaffordable sum in hand right now. She looked at him with a serious expression, apologized and asked, however, why on earth was he interfering in business negotiations now? What she hates most is being interrupted in the middle of conversations with clients. Who knows what price one will have to pay for careless words and whether it will result in death. He turned away and said that he heard her. He went to the exit and said that he would return when they were finished. Carlene chuckled and said that it was a waste of good tea. The protagonist called her name, but she interrupted him and said that if he was going to say that they currently lack funds or ask for a delay to raise money, he should think twice. She had heard this from his father too many times. He asked with a slightly displeased look, maybe he should just kill her quietly? Marbus said that he didn't even have to think about it. This wasn't an enemy that left him any chance. He could try, of course, if he wanted to be torn to shreds in a second. Crow said that at this rate, they would be left with nothing at all. He was disappointed in the contractor. Pullen said that the late Lord Rune acted with the best intentions. Walter loudly told the Lord that he should be brave. They would find a way. He had complete confidence in his ingenuity. He called her and said that if she allowed him, he begged her to have mercy on them. Everyone was shocked by what he had just said. At the same time, Richel looked at Welland's portrait and thought that the journey they had made to meet Lyon was worth it. He saw his energy and thought he sensed vast reserves of mana circulating deep within him. If he could persuade him to join the Eremit School of Magic, it would be a great success for the Academy. Surely there was some way to ingratiate himself with him. He created a ball of energy that showed him an old man who told the head that he was conjuring him not to disappear so suddenly. The Academy was in an uproar due to his absence. He agreed and said that he asked for permission. He would explain himself some other time. Moreover, something else is important now. The old man asked, "What is the matter?" He asked with a smile, "How many gold coins do they have in their bins?" At the same time, Carlene said with a smile that, frankly, he stunned her. He doesn't think that the sleepers are some kind of gang of cutthroats, does he? She released a small amount of energy, which destroyed his mug of tea. She looked at him with a serious expression and said that she assures him that they are more calculating than one might think. Walter immediately drew his sword and loudly asked how she dared to threaten his grace. She said with a smile that only those who do not fulfill their loan obligations will know their wrath. Did she make herself clear? MC called her by name and said that they have no gold. She asked him to explain, and he said that, objectively speaking, everything was empty. She looked a little surprised, then smiled and said that now she understood why he was trembling like a frightened puppy. She released a strong energy and said in a serious voice that then he should allow it. She would personally demonstrate what happens to defaulters. Richelle burst into the office and loudly said that he asked her to stop. He raised his hand and asked them not to even think of burying Aramina's future young talents. Leon looked at his comrade in bewilderment. Walter smiled and exclaimed that, as expected, the young master had a plan after all. The protagonist clarified, "Is it really Aramina?" Carlene glared at him angrily. She calmed down and exhaled. MC clarified that he would first ask his comrades to leave. They needed to settle this privately. After some time, the protagonist clarified that, on the condition that he officially join Aramina, they would pay 10% of his debt to Carlene. He got it all right, right? Richelle raised his cup with a smile and exclaimed that everything was correct. In the recent territorial war with the Sylvesters, MC definitely used necromancy. Lion asked why Richelle thought so. Richelle replied that it was because the protagonist wouldn't have won the battle otherwise. Carlene probably thought the same. That's why she came here. Isn't that right? Carlene smirked and noted that these were clever mages. It wasn't like it was a secret. Richelle was right. She also believed that their client, the head of the Marbas clan, had regained the clan's former power, which was why she went hunting. MC asked if she thought they were already able to pay off the debt. Carlene raised a finger and said that honestly, such thoughts sometimes happened, but she didn't really believe they would be able to pay off right now, so they would put this conversation off for now. Marbas thought he'd let him climb another mountain of debt. Lyon noted that Richelle wanted to hire him, while Carlene wanted to settle the score. He still didn't understand the reasons for their confidence. The great necromancer's power might never return. The protagonist could have been helped by other aristocrats, or, in the final analysis, mercenaries. Carlene clarified, but surely all this costs a fortune? Richelle laughed and added that he would never believe that this war could be won with money. That's why he first thought of necromancy, Marbas's unique power, that it was an opportunity to bring back necromancy. Carlene added that even if MC had only a tiny bit of Welland's original powers, getting close to the continent's still unrecognized genius was a good investment. Lion asked, but the debt wouldn't go away, would it? Carlene put her hand in her pocket and replied that, of course. Loan sharks were no joke to him. She pointed the pistol at the protagonist and added, "Here's why." Richelle raised his hand tensely and asked if she minded if they spoke privately for a minute. This talent was indispensable for Aramina. Carlene pocketed the pistol and replied that they could do as they wished, but collecting debts was her priority, so they should know. She opened the door slightly and left the room. Richelle smiled and clarified, "They barely got out, didn't they?" The protagonist noted that he wouldn't say he particularly trusted him. Richelle wasn't human, was he? Richelle grinned and clarified that the same could be said about MC. He pointed at Marbas and said that Leon had gotten mixed up with one of the 72 demons. Marbas grinned and noted that the mage who could see him without any contracts. He instantly changed his appearance and asked who Richelle was. Richelle enveloped his body in mana and horns appeared on his head. Marbas noted what dragon meant. He thought they all died in that anti-magic war. The protagonist was surprised, and Marbas said everything was correct. It was clear just by looking at the horns and tail. Richelle clarified that he too was curious as to why one of the 72 demons had suddenly approached humans. The reasons are unknown to him, but it is definitely somehow connected with the first head. MC asked him not to worry and replied that Lord Marbas was on humanity's side. Marbas was different from the other demons. Marbas said everything was correct. Even though he was a demon, he didn't share their views. Richelle raised his hand and pointed out that, in that case, Marbas had no reason to interfere in human squabbles. Lion asked if he could ask what was required of him. Besides joining Aramina, he needed to know what he was signing up for. Richelle explained that their school was essentially for hermits. The protagonist would be paid for membership, and MC, in turn, should strive to rise as a mage. Lion asked if that was all. Marva said he didn't believe it. Why keep silent? Richelle must tell everything as it is. Richelle noted with a smile that they were very sensitive, but he would have told it even without their pressure. You cannot join any other schools, for any money. Those are all the conditions. Marbas asked if this was to suppress competition. Richelle calmly agreed and clarified that this was one of the reasons. But the main one was different. Richelle put a token on the table and said that besides Aramina, there were 2 more prestigious magic schools, and 1 completely worshipped demons. Marbas thought that they were up to something bad after all. If only he had woken up just a little earlier. Marbas asked what they were trying to achieve. Richelle thought for a moment and answered that they wanted to revive the demon king, Baal, the great war against the demons. The first full-scale battle of humanity against the demons. The tragic event in which King Esteban found eternal peace. Bright streams of mana directed across the earth from the king's staff. The demons looked down in fear. The earth instantly shook, and the demons were enveloped in dark mana. Welland picked up the book, streams of energy radiating from it. He calmly closed it. Welland and his comrades looked at the petrified demons. In the present, Richel said that during that brutal battle, the king managed to seal bail. However, over time, the seal weakened, to such an extent that the demon's awakening could happen at any moment. The protagonist clarified that he had heard that His Majesty had lost his mind. Esteban was once great, but now they call him the Fool Archmage. Isn't Richel talking about him? Richel replied that everything was correct. Demons will always find a way. However, they should have realized this by now, considering who they were communicating with. MC thought that it seemed that many representatives of other races, including dragons, died in that war. Now everything fits together. Richel is telling the truth. Lion asked if Richel didn't want him to join other schools because one of them harbored demons. Richel agreed, saying that's why the protagonist should join Aramina. He was sure the MC would discover many new things with them. Marbus noted that it would require a lot of money though. Richel replied that they couldn't solve their financial problems forever. Lion inquired if there was any way for him to earn money regularly. A debt of 500,000 gold was quite problematic. Richel looked down thoughtfully, covering his mouth with his hand. He smiled and said, there was one way. The Adventurers Guild. Plus, Carlene was a close associate of the guild's leader. If the protagonist handles the orders and earns a gold badge, the MC would be able to earn 1,000 gold per order. Lion was stunned and wondered, what's the point of 1,000 gold? He bowed and asked Carlene to put in a good word for him. Marbus let out an irritated sigh and called the protagonist a fool. Crow crossed his arms and yelled at Marbus not to insult the Lord. MC did this on the spur of the moment. Marbus asked where Crow got that from. Crow sternly replied that the old man had said so. Marbus slapped his forehead in irritation. Richel quickly looked at the door and yelled that he was sure Carlene had been eavesdropping. She would help them, right? Carlene instantly opened the door and remarked that Richel was very perceptive. She looked at Marbus in surprise. Richel raised his hand and said they should introduce themselves. This is a demon on the young lord's side. Carlene smirked and, placing her hand on her forehead, asked, are you serious? They always cause nothing but trouble. Sometime later in the forest, the comrades are walking among the trees. Carlene asked, so, does that mean she has to escort them to the guild as well? Richel turned his head to the side and clarified. For the hundreds of thousands of gold that MC would soon pay, that was the least she could do, right? He asked not to misunderstand. Lion asked, what kind of place is this? An adventurer's guild. Marbus, sitting on his shoulder, said he was also interested. There wasn't one like this in the past. This is something new. Carlene answered seriously that, simply put, it's a place where people go with various assignments. You can take group orders and split the profits among the group members. Or you can work independently. That's what this place is. But if you're weak, you'll simply die without a trace on your first assignment, and if you do well, you'll become rich. Marbus noted that this is a place where people waste their lives. Richel clarified that not everything is so bad. The Adventurers Guild is neither good nor bad. With their recommendation, you can easily get a job as a knight or mage, even in another country. It's the most lucrative job for those who are skilled in something. The protagonist asked if he could elaborate on the gold badge and ranks. Richel agreed and turned to Carlene. She asked irritably, will he boss her around now? There are 5 ranks in the guild: copper, silver, platinum, and titanium. Ranks range from weak to strong. By advancing a rank, you gain access to missions that pay accordingly. Lion asked, so the best earning option is for titanium badge holders? Richel laughed and replied that it was certainly true, but that was unlikely, so he didn't even mention it. There are hardly a dozen titanium badge holders on the entire continent. The missions they are assigned are valued at tens of thousands of gold coins. There aren't many such wealthy clients in the world. After some time in the Empire, the comrades approached the knights. Carlene said that they should at least get a copper badge first. The Empire's laws make it somewhat difficult for newcomers to advance. The protagonist didn't answer, and Richel asked, why the escalation? After some time at the bar, Richel asked the MC to simply start with a small test. They were already there. Lion looked at the people and asked, is this the Adventurers Guild? The protagonist turned his head to the side, scanning the room. The leader of the Adventurers Guild, Raleigh Finelia, noted that it seemed like problematic clients had arrived. The comrades walked forward among the tables. The guild members were talking calmly. Carlene passed them, and they turned their attention to her. The guild member clarified, is that Carlene over there? The comrade replied that it looked like it. She was looking at him with a greedy gaze. I don't really want to borrow money from someone like that. What was she doing in the guild building? Is Richel, the head of the Aremina school, with her? The man sternly called out to the head of the school and remarked that Richel, so young, was already the head of a magic school. The guild member raised his cup to his mouth in disgust and said that the beer had even spoiled because of them. The world is very unfair. Richel, smiling, said that it seemed like everyone here hated him. Carlene ordered them to stop talking and asked them to hurry. They shouldn't care about people like guild members. The protagonist asked, so where's the person they're looking for? He didn't sense the presence of any surprisingly strong people in this place. Marbus clarified that this was not true. Could MC really not sense the mana aimed at them at all? Crow, in human form, was startled by the sensation. The protagonist instantly closed his eyes. He felt a circle of mana form beneath their feet. MC opened his eyes in surprise and said that he thought he could feel it. Raleigh approached the protagonist with great speed. She and Carlene instantly drew their weapons. Rally brought her sword to MC's neck, and Carleen instantly held her pistol to her head. The guild members' mouths dropped in surprise. Carleen smiled and noted that Rally had become more aggressive since their last meeting. Rally turned her head to the side and clarified that she seemed to have already asked not to call her by her name so thoughtlessly. Lion inquired, "So she's the strongest here?" Rally apologized and said she didn't remember giving him her word. "Who is he?" Marbas grinned, thinking she was a true monster, perhaps far stronger than anyone present. The protagonist introduced himself and said he was the head of the Marbas clan. That was his name. Sometime later, the companions were sitting on the sofa in the room. Rally raised her cup and said she'd heard rumors that the head of the Marbas clan had changed. But such a young one? Carleen clarified that MC's magical potential was astonishing. She could vouch for that. Rally asked sternly, what was the aristocrat doing in their humble adventurer's abode? Carleen smiled tensely and, laughing, replied that circumstances had forced him to do so. Raleigh noted that it was equally strange that he was traveling with a demon. Carleen's friends were getting stranger. Marbas ordered a quick apology to the contractor. Crow confidently agreed with his comrade. Even the cat began to sound reasonable. Marbas screamed furiously. "What does this mean?" Lion calmly replied that he really did have his reasons. He had to pay off his debts. That's why he was looking for work here. Carleen sternly replied that it was an adventurer's guild where one could work anonymously. Wasn't that her most pleasant trait? There was no reason to refuse the protagonist. Richelle agreed with her, smiling, and asked to give MC a chance. Raleigh remarked that they were both quite persuasive. But one can die on missions. The protagonist said that death is a faithful companion of Marbas's house. Moreover, Richelle had already informed him of this. He thought that a fate worse than failing to pay off his debts to Carleen would be hard to find. Raleigh calmly replied that it was true. She'll give him a chance. Raleigh poured tea on the table. Threads of mana instantly appeared on the floor. MC looked at them in amazement. Marbas remarked that it was some kind of teleportation magic. A rather complex formula, but recreated with such ease. This means that the sorceress is very gifted. The room instantly changed and knights appeared in it. Raleigh got up from the couch and said that the entrance test was quite simple. Among the statues presented, only one contained mana, and it was real. Raleigh asked them to find it and added that they had 30 minutes to complete the task. If the protagonist fails, he will return. MC is ready for the task, right? Leon replied that he would try. Raleigh announced that she was starting the countdown. She asked Carleen to prepare the hourglass. Carleen irritably raised her hands, radiating mana from them, and remarked that she was tired of this. She would help only this once. Carleen instantly raised the hourglass with mana. The protagonist stood between the knights and looked away. Raleigh clarified that these statues were quite fast. The enormous statue raised its weapon above MC's head. Raleigh ordered Lion to prepare for battle. The statues quickly moved toward the protagonist. The statue delivered a powerful attack, but the protagonist managed to jump aside. MC quickly turned his head to the side. The enemy swung its weapon, but Lion ducked, avoiding the attack. Carleen snorted in displeasure. Richelle asked if she thought Lady Raleigh had set up too difficult a test. This was a test even experienced wizards would have difficulty passing. The protagonist's talent was outstanding, but MC was still too young. Carleen replied that, in her opinion, Leon was a child who knew all too well what happened to the weak and innocent. Although his chances were slim, she suggested they simply observe for now. Marvis thought that the statues themselves weren't particularly strong, but finding the real one is almost impossible. The mana imbued within him is too insignificant. Crow raised his hand to his chin and noted that the task was difficult. But even a foolish lion could understand that the contractor would fight. Marbas wondered what the contractor would do. Raleigh considered accepting such a child into the guild. It was too risky. Even great talents could break these lands. The protagonist quickly jumped aside and looked at the opponents. He noticed the statue. MC raised his hands and created mana spheres in them. The statues looked at him, and Lion channeled dark mana from his body. The mana instantly enveloped the statues' bodies. The protagonist said he thought this option was the most effective. Everyone was stunned by this. MC clarified that Lord Marbas had taught him that he wouldn't always have an abundance of black magic spells at his disposal. You have to be able to cope with what you have. Lion created spears of darkness. His comrades looked at them in amazement and wondered, are these the very spears of darkness? The protagonist raised his hand and pointed the spears towards the opponents. They struck the statues with force, creating flashes of mana. The stone remains of the knights fell to the ground. Marvis yelled in surprise that it was crazy. Carleen raised her hand to the stone and said that MC's mana reserves and control were amazing. But still, the goal of the test is to find the statue that has mana imbued into it. It seems the protagonist has failed after all. Rochelle noted that Leon only had one way to pass the test. If the protagonist manages to use this method, he simply must obtain MC in Eremina. Leon closed his eyes and asked the wandering spirit of the underworld to hear the call of a direct descendant of the Marbas family. Streams of dark mana surrounded the protagonist. MC commanded him to open his eyes and rise. The earth shook instantly, and boulders rose into the air. Rochelle grinned madly, thinking that Lion had had a plan all along. Mana is identical to life force, meaning a creature imbued with it is considered alive. Therefore, after killing it, it can be raised by necromantic spells. But how many people are capable of coming up with such a solution? Richel joyfully exclaimed that it seemed the guy would go far, contrary to all expectations. Carlene admitted that MC was an outstanding sorcerer. Initially, she thought the most amazing thing about Lion was his mana, but the protagonist had found such an amazing use for it in a short time. Raleigh asked in surprise how MC did it. Lion replied that he had only killed them all and raised the only living creature, nothing more. Raleigh wondered why the protagonist thought the statue was alive. MC replied that according to his knowledge of golems, they were considered alive. He pointed his finger at the enemy and said that this golem is real. The enemy has mana. Lion noticed the hourglass. The time hadn't passed yet, and the protagonist inquired, "Didn't he pass the test?" Raleigh smiled and exclaimed that MC was simply amazing. Lion clarified that it wasn't at all. Only tactical thinking is the bare minimum required of the head of a noble house. Raleigh announced that the protagonist had passed. She would give him a silver membership badge. Bronze is too weak for someone with such immense power. No objections, right? Carlene was surprised and clarified that Raleigh should give him a silver badge right from the start. Richel laughed and remarked on how many discoveries he had made during this journey. The great Marbus has a very outstanding contractor. He asked for his congratulations. Marbus smiled calmly and said that, considering who was the ruler of MC, this was not surprising. Crow glared at him and yelled that Marbus couldn't even accept a compliment with dignity. What was the point of Marbus anyway? After some time, Valter passed through the wall. He was amazed to think that most golems of their kind were of magical origin, but there are also cases when a real living entity with a core turns into a golem. Using this unique trait as a basis, Lord Lion was able to find a genuine golem among those created using magic. He knew the protagonist could handle it. Raleigh said she had to admit that this was an unprecedented case. She hated to admit it, but MC had everything they needed. Lion thanked the guild leader. The protagonist asked for a reply, and asked what the average fee for a silver badge mission was. Marbus thought this was a terrible thirst for money. Richel smiled, and noted that it was just like that. Neither hello nor goodbye. Carlene clarified that it depended on the specific mission, but she guessed about 300 gold on average. However, compared to the amount of Lion's principal debt, it would be better to hurry and earn a gold badge. Richel said that it was still a fairly good start. He honestly thought it would be years before the guild leader would deign to award a silver badge to a newcomer. Carlene agreed and noted that stability was Raleigh's main trait. The guild leader calmly said that the protagonist would receive his first mission and accompanying instructions tomorrow. In the meantime, she suggested returning and resting. MC bowed and thanked Raleigh for her time. Raleigh raised her hand, and the golems instantly rose. Valter exclaimed in amazement that she had restored the golems instantly. The amount of mana was already surprising, but the control was no less amazing. Valter knew that the guild leader was a real monster. Richel, smiling, said that if that was all, he would call a break. After a while, Raleigh sat on a chair in the room. She thought about MC with a thoughtful expression. Raleigh remarked that she had thought the test would end there, but the candidate suddenly discovered a completely unheard of method that ultimately allowed him to pass the test. The task of recognizing a golem imbued with life force truly presents no difficulty for the young lord. However, at the end, MC seemed to hesitate. Just for a moment, but still. Why did he hesitate? Raleigh clarified to conceal her own strength and rose from her chair. She thought that the Marbus clan always stood on the brink of life and death. After a long fall, they finally captured the monster. Raleigh looked at the moon and said that what bothered her most were those lifeless eyes of his. Where is Lion's gaze even directed? What is he thinking? After some time, the comrades gathered in the guild master's room. Raleigh, holding a scroll in her hand, clarified that this was his first mission. The protagonist looked at the scroll and read that Silishi was the head of the Ardenism religious sect, a worshipper of Arden, the goddess of creation. He needed to find and capture this priest. Raleigh replied that this was precisely the case. Silishi was a city south of the capital. Rumors of the priest's corrupt practices were already circulating. The protagonist needed to complete the mission with all diligence and receive 100 gold coins. Carlene asked if the leader was being too harsh on a newcomer. Raleigh looked angrily into her eyes. She replied that, given the MC's skills, he could handle it. Richel smiled and asked, "So, deadly traps aren't out of the question?" But no matter, this mission meant advancement after all. Lion agreed and said he would try his best. Raleigh clarified that if the protagonist failed, he would be demoted to bronze rank. The MC calmly noted that this was fair. The guild leader looked at Richel and added that as for their couple, they could help MC as much as they could. Carlene yelled that she already said it was hard. She really had to go. Richel laughed joyfully and exclaimed that they would be happy to. It was an honor for them to see everything the young lord was capable of. Carlene asked irritably, was her opinion no longer taken into account? Leon bowed and thanked them. He clarified that his father had taught him that any help should be accepted with gratitude. Carlene looked at him in a stupor. Crow smiled and exclaimed, "Well said. My lord knows how to deal with people." Marbus asked, "What's so surprising about that?" "It's an innate gift for any demonic race, to bend to the will of mortals." Valter pointed out that the lord wasn't a demon, but a human. Marbus looked at him sternly, and Walter was terrified. Leon gave his word that he wouldn't let them down. They really need the money now. At the same time, in the church, the daughters of Bishop Cadone pray over a chalice. The priest, the head of the Arden's religious sect, Cadone, asked his daughters for forgiveness. Words appeared in the thicket that only one of them would rise as a divine miracle virgin, embodying the blessing of the Creator's holy will. And so as not to interfere with the sun, the only one in the rising, the second is doomed to oblivion. But in the end, both will become one. To accomplish this, one must die. Faith on the continent is fundamentally divided into two opposing teachings. One is addressed to the goddess creator of this world, and the one behind the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. Her name is the winged goddess Arden. She is worshipped by the Arden's church, servants of light. The second teaching is addressed to the devil and his army of 172 demons, including Baal, a cult of the devil's resurrection. With the exception of a couple of outcasts of the human race, most lean toward faith in Arden. Among them are the chosen ones, whom the goddess endowed with divine power. Holy virgins revered throughout the continent, performing miracles. After some time, the carriage is driving along a path in the forest. The coachman noticed the noise coming from the carriage. The comrades are sitting inside the carriage. Some time ago, the coachman asked if they wanted him to take them to Selishi. The coachman apologized and clarified that it was difficult to get there because of all this religious unrest. Even pilgrims stopped coming to this place. Why do they need to go there? Richelle replied that it was a long and uninteresting story. He turned to Carlene, and she irritably agreed. She sternly threw the bag of coins on the table. Carlene remarked that she was sure that this gold well explained everything the coachman needed to know. If not, they would gladly look for someone else. She was sure that there were more unpretentious coachmen. The coachman confidently exclaimed that if safety was guaranteed, he would gladly take them. The coachman thought the glitter of gold had momentarily clouded his judgment, but now he was unsure. The city of Selishi was an unfortunate victim of the religious strife that had swept across the land. The newly minted cardinal had sworn to protect the archbishop, but ultimately succumbed to the pressure. It all happened because of holy power. The long absence of the new miracle-working saint was a death sentence for the shaken faith in Arden. At this rate, rumors of the disappearance of divine blessing from the face of the earth would only grow stronger. Lyon said that as far as he understood, their goal was to uncover the corruption crimes of Archbishop Cadone. Is that all? Walter remarked that even that sounded problematic enough. Marbas grinned and said that he cared little for the saint, and the protagonist certainly shouldn't. With the current power of the MC, all these morals are nothing compared to. Richelle said he hoped so. Over the centuries of Marbas's imprisonment, the human species has become significantly stronger. Not enough to defeat Marbas, but they shouldn't be underestimated. Carlene agreed and added that given that they came for the soul of a priest, there are hardly any people on the entire continent who are not touched by the faith in Arden, although the faith has been experiencing difficulties since the disappearance of the Holy Virgins. Richelle clarified that he thinks the whole problem is that Holy Virgins historically appeared only in the lineage of priests. It couldn't be otherwise, but this time, things are much more serious. The protagonist agreed and said that this time the priest had twins, instead of the usual only child. It's not surprising that all the foundations of the church are crumbling. After all, only one descendant can inherit divine power. Walter clarified, so it turns out that power cannot be divided between the sisters? Marbas replied that any supernatural power passed down through a family line cannot be shared. He believes that one of the daughters faces inevitable death. Richelle thought that no matter how much he observed MC, Lyon was a strange guy. The protagonist was simply incomprehensible. The carriage stopped, and the coachman announced that they were there. This was the religious center of the continent, the holy city of Selishi. After some time, the archbishop's chief butler, Glazer, walked down the castle corridor. He calmly opened the door. Glazer addressed the holiness and announced that guild representatives had arrived to accept the request. Cadone sternly asked if the butler was sure they weren't in cahoots with Imperial intelligence. Glazer confirmed this and replied that the Boundless Lotus Guild had assured him of this. The priest noted that confidentiality in this matter was the highest priority. After all, it was necessary to save his daughter. After a while, Glazer introduced himself and greeted the distinguished guests. Richelle asked if it was the butler who submitted the request to investigate the archbishop's corruption crimes. Glazer replied that everything was correct, but he didn't think the head of Aramina would honor them with the request. Richelle apologized and said he would disappoint him, but he wasn't the one carrying it out. The butler was surprised and asked who else could have been entrusted with this task. The protagonist calmly replied, him. Glazer asked with bewilderment, isn't MC too young for such a job? After all, the matter must be conducted in strict secrecy from the archbishop. Lyon raised his hand, holding a silver badge. The butler yelled in amazement. Could that really be the silver badge of the Adventurers Guild? The protagonist said that before he got down to business, he had one question. The archbishop's two daughters, who had disappeared without a trace. They did oppose his will, didn't they? The butler fell into a stupor and thought. The shadows of two sisters flashed behind him. Glazer lowered his head and replied that they would be better off discussing this in a secluded place. He was afraid the story would take a long time. Sometime later, in the building, the comrades were sitting at a table with the holy virgins and the butler. Glazer, looking at the protagonist, thought that things had come to this. Salishi's influence had indeed weakened recently, but sending such a young boy was completely unacceptable. Lion clarified that they hadn't gotten to the main point yet, and asked the butler to cast aside unnecessary doubts. He hoped Glazer understood him, although, of course, whether he could provide the necessary assistance remained to be seen. The butler wondered if the protagonist was a telepath. They said that this spell could be used by mages of at least an advanced level. MC said it was better not to hide it. Everyone here knew that the request was initiated directly by His Eminence. So how about revealing everything secret and explaining the main problem to them? Glazer was amazed and thought that it seemed the protagonist could not be fooled. He folded his hands and replied that he understood the Lord. The butler sternly asked to allow him to explain everything to them. Some time ago, the priest's daughters were sitting over a bowl of water. Magic seals appeared on their chests. The priest irritably put his hand to his face and asked, "Was that prophecy really true? What awaits his beloved daughters?" The woman asked for forgiveness for the Holy Father and replied that the saint's divine power was divided between the girls. She is afraid that in order to fully use it, only one must. The priest angrily interrupted her and shouted, "Does she mean that he must kill one of his own daughters to obtain the divine power in full?" The woman was frightened and asked for forgiveness. The door opened slightly and the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Knights, Caliban, entered the church. He introduced himself and apologized for the intrusion. Caliban extended his hand toward the scroll and declared that by the authority vested in him by His Majesty, he would announce to the Bishop of Selishi his will. In the name of Esteban, the son of the Empire, it was decreed that there could not be two suns under this sky. The Holy See must surely understand this. Upon the bishop's two daughters reaching adulthood, one would continue to live as a miracle virgin, and the other would submit and serve as a complement to the saint's divine power. This would be done by burning in the name of cleansing the false saint from sin. The priest screamed furiously, "How could this be? The king is also a father. How could His Majesty demand that he burn a child?" Caliban remarked that the king was a father to all the people. He asked for faith that the king took the priest's sacrifice as seriously as the priest. Caliban ordered his assistants to go. They had finished here. The priest immediately knelt and asked why the goddess was sending him such trials. First, the goddess snatched the twins from his care, and now she wants to take one? The priest bowed his head and, weeping, asked what sin he had committed to deserve this. Glazer finished his story. Richel clarified that, in short, for decades, a miracle maiden capable of inheriting divine power had not appeared, and then the bishop had twins, equally entitled to Arden's blessing. Therefore, the divine power was divided. He understood everything correctly, right? The butler agreed with him. He calmly said that he wished to preserve the lives of both of His Eminence's daughters. That's why he sent a request to the guild. Glazer understood very well that this was a crime against the Emperor's will, but nevertheless, Lion clarified that he had listened to the butler's story. Could he now speak directly with the victims of the tragedy? Glazer agreed, and the protagonist asked to do so in private, if possible. After a while, MC rose from his chair and looked at the sisters. Lion knelt down and asked if either of them was willing to sacrifice their lives for the other. Marbus yelled, "Where has the contractor's politeness gone?" The protagonist calmly replied that sometimes politeness comes at the expense of effectiveness. He was diligently prepared to find a way for both to survive, but that wouldn't save their family from the Emperor's wrath. Therefore, in the worst-case scenario, one of them would have to make this terrible sacrifice. Lion sternly clarified that he would ask again. Was either of them willing to sacrifice themselves? Holy Wonder Maidens. People have coined this lofty nickname, although there's nothing so grandiose about them. Sister and she. They were nothing more than bearers of a curse from the day of their birth. Enormous demons flew over the city, which was ablaze with bright fire. The townspeople scattered in different directions, and the priest stood on the balcony and said, "Damn it, holy maidens have been necessary at all times. But what can they do against this demonic threat now, without divine light?" The knight shouted, "His Eminence, he had better leave. It is dangerous to stay here now." The priest shouted, "Devil's spawn. They will not earn his forgiveness in this life or the next. Those who turn their backs on divine will get what they deserve." Some time ago, Leia said, "May the goddess Arden protect them. What an honor that their child will become the next holy maiden." The priest said, "So be it, Leia. But great honor usually comes with great responsibility and duty." Frankly, it terrifies him. He's afraid that their child, though it will receive the honors due to a holy virgin, will also be exploited as an instrument of faith. Leia extended her hand to his clenched fist and asked Carden, her love, not to worry. She would raise their child strong enough and train it herself. She only asked for permission to name her Elysia. A name given in the hope that people all over the world would be able to enjoy a paradise on Earth, Elysium. It suits her, doesn't it? Of course, unfortunately, Not everyone is given the opportunity to enjoy a mother's wisdom personally. A difficult birth exhausted her strength and she left them without even having time to welcome them into this world. Their tragic fate cannot be denied. Misfortune accompanied them from birth, a cruel joke of fate that could not be undone. Such was the test sent to them by the goddess. Truly so it was. Currently the girls were looking at MC. One of the sisters said, humbly bowing her head, "It's her." The sister frowned and said, "No, she is the one who must disappear. After all, she was born first. Only she has the power to fulfill mother's will, sister. She herself knows that she is superior to her in everything. Compared to her, she is a pathetic fake." The girl lowered her head and said, "Please." She cried and said, she does not want to hear such things from her. MC looked at them thoughtfully and said, "He will not pretend that he understands much about the matter, dear ladies, but if they allow him to summarize, they are both ready to sacrifice their lives, right? Then he does not understand what the problem is at all." Marbas said, "Contractor? Has he forgotten or something? He needs to find a way to save both lives and not leave them to fate. If they both die, then he will not receive a reward at all." Lion smiled and spoke. "He is as insightful as ever, Lord. His wisdom cannot be denied." He spoke. "Then he believes. Only a method in which they both survive will satisfy them." The girl spoke. "They will be rewarded for their efforts. Let him be sure of it. They only ask that father not suffer, no matter what happens to them. He is not to blame for anything." The sister said, "Exactly so. Father always tried his best at his post." Lion spoke. "He understood, ladies." He then asked to tell him a little more about the trials that befell them. Had he correctly assumed that one of them would be burned at the stake? The girl answered, "Yes, to be precise. Then in 2 days. And as long as there is no other plan, she will take on this sacrifice." Her sister screamed, "Sister, no. 2 days. There is no time at all. This is the deal. Nothing to sign." MC spoke up, intending to find out if there was any reasonable way out of the situation. He turned and asked, "Sir Richel?" Richel waved his hand and suggested first verifying the presence of the marks that distinguish the saints. Lion asked if he could ask them to show him the marks. The girl said yes, but there were several locations. Her sister said they had to ask everyone except Lord Lion and the lady to leave the premises for a couple of minutes. Carleen said that wherever their marks were, she would insist on expelling this vile mage. Richel asked again, what did he mean? As befits the only archmage here, he should be the one. Carleen shooed everyone out the door and said she assured them she could easily recognize the distinctive marks, but she would not allow anyone to stare at the girls, saints or any other. She dusted off her gloves, and the girls exchanged glances. They lowered their dresses, as their marks were on their chests. MC began to peer thoughtfully and said, "Extracting or transferring the Sacred Maiden's power through magic is definitely impossible, he must admit." Carleen said, given the location, she could understand why they had difficulty displaying these marks in public. Marbas spoke up. He saw only one solution here. They, mortals, might need time to accept this, but in the end, MC answered, "Yes, one will still have to die. There is no other way. The frightening power of the prophet and the fate that will destroy both of these innocent souls." Marbas said he had never seen such a look on his face before. He supposes this is anger coming from the depths of his heart. After a while, Louis sat in the hall and spoke. Finally, "The Holy Miracle Maiden must be presented today." Caliban said, "That's right, His Prince. 20 years have passed. The people will applaud her ascension." Louis said, "Although this day is a little dark." Caliban spoke, "The preliminary burning of the witch for this purpose." Louis said it was all because the previous Sacred Maiden had an urge to give birth to twins, but they had already waited too long for them to mature. Suddenly, MC appeared behind them and asked, "Lord, isn't virtue in giving life to those who want to live, and death to those who want to die?" Marbas asked, "What did he mean?" Lion replied, "One of the girls is lying, he's sure of it. Perhaps he's the only one who sees it, given how deeply connected he is with death. But one of them desperately wants to live, while the other is determined to die for the good cause. He can't stop thinking about it. Who should ultimately live, and who should die?" Marbas asked if it wasn't too late to ask such questions. MC replied, "Perhaps," but he was afraid as he had never been taught how to behave in such situations. After a while, Louis stood up and said, "Welcome. He, Louis von Arkheim. By the power vested in him by His Majesty the Emperor, he is about to witness the apparition of a new holy virgin." The townspeople cheered loudly. Louis nodded and waved his hand, then said that tonight they would be enveloped by the darkest and most impenetrable night they had ever seen. Nevertheless, the darkness will give way to light, and the world will receive its miracle virgin. For this, they must consign the nameless witch to the flames. By this time, everything was already prepared in the street. Louis looked at Caliban and nodded. Caliban said, "There cannot be 2 suns in the sky, just as there cannot be 2 holy virgins chosen by the goddess Arden. And yet the Holy Father had 2 daughters in order to sow discord on the continent. This is clearly the work of the devil. In the name of His Majesty himself, the dubious witch must restore justice before everyone's eyes. Are there any objections from those present?" The townspeople remained silent, and the girls stood next to Carden with their heads bowed. Louis approached them and said, "What a pity, because she was so beautiful." If she weren't a witch, he would have taken her as a concubine just for her face. Carden clenched his fist upon hearing these words. Lewis placed his hand on his shoulder and walked forward. Caliban looked closely at the priest's tense face and followed the prince. Carden asked, "Well, is there any hope of saving his girls?" MC removed his hood and replied, "It's almost impossible, Your Eminence. But since we're on the subject, he must ask him something, Your Eminence." Glazer asked, "What is it, my lord?" Lion muttered, "Is that possible?" The priest stared at him in surprise, and after a while, the girls stood facing each other in the room. The girl said, "Quiet, not worth the tears." She always knew that she must sacrifice herself for the greater good. The girl cried and said, "But they have done nothing to deserve such a fate, sister. Can their very birth be considered a sin?" The girl said, "The ways of the goddess are inscrutable, and yet they must follow her will without looking back. Only in this way will the prophecy be fulfilled. They cannot back down. It will be easier than the bitterness that befell them at birth. At least now they have a choice." Suddenly, Caliban's loud command rang out, "Tie up the witch and mount her on the pyre." The girl walked toward the door and, turning around, said goodbye to her sister. The sister burst into tears and said, "No." She fell to her knees and began to whisper, "She begs, begs, begs. She is so sorry, sister. She asked for forgiveness, that she was insincere. In truth, she is grateful that she will die in her place." Suddenly, MC appeared behind her and directed bright mana in her direction. She passed out, and Marvis asked if this was truly the best solution he could come up with. MC replied that he was afraid it was, even if it was far from the very concept of best. If only there was another way. At that moment, the girl was already tied to a pole and about to be set on fire. The man approached the boxes and lit them. Louis ordered to behold. This is the moment of the ascension of a true saint. In some way, such is the prince's duty to suppress the voice of doubt. Caliban asked, "Would anyone dare doubt his greatness, his prince? Let the entire empire see that only death awaits those who disobey the rules." Dawn was already near. The fire approached the girl and she screamed loudly. MC stood to the side and watched what was happening along with his acquaintances. Carlene spoke up. Frankly, his methods slightly shocked her. Was this really the only way? Richelle laughed and said, "It's not the best ending, he must admit. But overall, it's not a failure." MC spoke. The bishop wanted his daughters to live. He wouldn't even dare to judge the depths of his despair. The girl's body was devoured by fire, and Lion continued talking. He didn't know His Eminence well as a person, but he wanted both girls to survive, no matter what. Even if it meant sacrificing himself, he was happy to see them both until the very end. It's a mystery to him now, but he's sure one day he'll understand. It's an indescribable feeling, an unexpected burden that lies heavily on the heart. What a nasty business this is, seriously. The girl looked at MC and thought, somehow he recognized those cold eyes. All is well. Justice, if anything, is the punishment she deserves. Unlike her older sister, she's not as pure at heart, and more than anything in the world, she fears death. That's why she preferred to hide behind the kindness of her words. Louis waved his hand and ordered to add fuel to the fire. A whole bucket was poured onto the boxes that stood at the foot. The girl mentally asked her sister to forgive her for her weakness. 2 days before, in Bishop Carden's office, MC said, "His Eminence, whom would he spare? Someone who desperately wants to live, or someone who is ready to sacrifice themselves for a great cause?" Carden frowned and asked, "Did he understand this from one look?" Lion answered, "Yes, sir, although it is difficult for him to explain it in words." Carden lowered his gaze and remained silent, and then said, "He believes he really has the insight to discern such things. He would spare his daughter, who will find peace after death." Currently, the girl stood next to her father and cried, covering her mouth with her hands. At that moment, the boys approached the carriage and climbed inside. MC asked, "What was the point of all this?" Marbas asked, "What did he mean, contractor?" Lion asked, "Why did the priest wish to save the one who chose to die?" Marbas asked again, "Wasn't the answer obvious?" "He wanted to teach her the greatest lesson of all, the true value of life." MC asked again, "The value of life?" Marbas said, "Exactly. After all, nothing changes the fact that the survivor will have to live for the deceased, as well as for herself. But what if they can decide for themselves? The one who chooses to die will understand well the gravity of such a choice. And she, better than anyone, will understand what her sacrifice for another means." Lion said, "Whereas the one who simply wants life will learn no lesson. A vassal of their house once said that gratitude is a feeling that fades with time. If you give everything away for free, an act of kindness quickly turns into a loop of exploitation." Marbas said, "That's all." Walter watched the scene and wondered, if such lawlessness continued, who would be left to direct their wrath? What had these young maidens done to deserve this cruelty? Richelle said, "There's nothing to be done, my lord. The continent desperately needs a miracle maiden. No matter how capable sorcerers they are not free from the Empire's tenacious grip. Now the whole world is watching Lady Chalice. No, the newly minted saint." The girl stood near the column, clutching the hem of her dress. Carlene sighed and said, "Their work here is done. Since the saint's power has finally become complete." She widened her eyes in surprise and asked, "What?" Everyone in the carriage froze in surprise. Richelle asked, "The holy power, is it still divided?" At that moment, the seal on the girl's chest began to glow, and Carden asked, "What?" She turned and screamed, "Father!" Louis approached them and asked, So, who's the fan of second-rate tricks here, right, Your Eminence?" He looked at them irritably, when suddenly Caliban let out a loud scream. The witch was executed, but the holy power is still scattered. He ordered the arrest of the bishop and his minions immediately. Cardan screamed, but this is beyond his comprehension. The girl they saw, they are the one he chose. Louis spoke up. He must admit, he didn't think he was so impudent, Cardan. He gave him time out of respect for the priest's authority, and this is how he repaid him. He ordered his execution. Caliban asked in surprise, "Your Majesty?" But to execute the spiritual leader of the entire Archime Empire. Louis turned and asked, and who knows, maybe he hid the real miracle girl somewhere. To pull such tricks in a time of despair, he probably hid her where she can no longer be found. They had long endured the turmoil caused by the saint's absence. Faith would no longer blind them. He ordered the archbishop's death. Caliban listened to him, then reached for his sword and told him not to blame him, His Eminence. He had brought this disaster upon himself. Cardan cried out in fear, but he had sacrificed his own daughter, as he had been ordered. Caliban said that if what he had said had been true, the holy mark would have been reunited. He swung his sword when suddenly a girl shielded Cardan. Caliban struck her and froze in surprise. Cardan cried out in fear, "No, what has she done? Her unworthy father does not deserve such a sacrifice." The girl spoke up, "This sacrifice is not just for him, father. It is better to die for something than to continue living for no reason." She had long searched for a purpose in life, but not for profit, so she wished for her little sister to live. That's how she wanted to escape existence. This is only a fitting end for her failure, doesn't he think? MC looked out the carriage window in surprise, and then released mana from his body. He said, on the other hand, he believes that one cannot punish someone who did not deserve punishment. Cardan asked, "A fitting end?" The girl replied, "That applies to him too, father." He widened his eyes in surprise and asked, "What is she talking about, his child? He always wished for them." He nodded his head, and the girl said, "Your Eminence, he never looked at them as his daughters, only as tools to support the power of his church." She asked him to face the truth. He only cared about his own convenience, but deep down, he never treated them as his own children. This is the perfect retribution for him. Maybe at least her death will have meaning. Cardan screamed, "His child." He rushed towards her and grabbed her, preventing her from falling to the ground. The second sister's body was covered in mana, and Marbas asked, "Contractor," he wouldn't have done it. MC asked to listen to him. "Two lost spirits. Damn them." Carleen asked, "What's going on?" MC closed his eyes and continued speaking, solemnly declaring that their worldly duty is not yet fulfilled. In the name of Marbas, he conjures them. He took out a book and opened it. And Carleen said in surprise, "So that's it? Necromancy." Mana rose into the air, and Leon spoke. "Will they answer the call of Leon von Marbas and continue to exist in the world of the living, but in the form of the undead?" The girl asked. "So she understands that he will bring them back to life, sir?" The sister asked. "Is that possible?" Lion answered, "If existence as the living dead can be called life, it was up to them to decide whether to gain form at the cost of losing their warmth and beating hearts or not. Whatever they chose, he would follow their will." The girls' bodies became covered in dark mana, and one of them asked what he demanded in return. MC replied, as rude as it may sound, he was asking them to become his loyal subjects. The girl asked, "Rude?" Rather, it sounded honest. It would be much more suspicious if he demanded nothing in return. MC closed his eyes and said, "He will take this as consent." He conjures these two souls lost in the world of the dead to serve him, the true heir of House Marbas. Are they both willing to swear allegiance to him for the rest of their existence? The girls exchanged glances and said, "Yes, Lord." The eye on the book gleamed brightly, and Lion said, "The contract is made." He closed the book and said, he hoped that their agreement would grant them the comfort they so desperately sought. He truly wanted them to find what they desired when their term of service was complete. Cardan sat on the ground with a blank stare, his daughter's body lying at his feet. Caliban looked around and wondered what he'd suddenly felt. A powerful magical surge somewhere nearby. Could there be another powerful mage nearby besides Prince Louis? MC opened the carriage door and stepped inside. Marbas hit him and screamed. How could he take subordinates without even consulting him? He'll get a lifelong lecture upon his return. MC clutched his head and said, "But he did manage to keep the girls alive, so to speak. That'll earn him a reward, right?" Walter nodded and said, "Definitely a masterful approach, sir." Carleen looked away and said, "Aha, more than enough." Some time ago, Marbas said that to raise mindless creatures, like evil spirits as undead, they first need to be branded. The thing is, they're too unpredictable, so branding is more reliable than subjugation. Leon asked, "What's the best way to subjugate a sentient being to your will, sir?" Marbas replied, "That's a good question. He needs to convince the spirit to serve voluntarily, using its attachment to the world of the living." MC asked again, "Convince them to serve voluntarily?" Marbas replied, "Exactly. Attachment and resentment usually prevent them from crossing the line of the afterlife. A necromancer can help them resolve grievances they held while alive, and in exchange, lend them the power they possess. In other words, it's subjugation." Leon answered thoughtfully. He understood, and it's up to him to honor their request or not. Marbas answered something like that. But the stronger their grievances, the more powerful they are. He ordered MC to remember this well. Necromancers are not just vultures who only want to exploit the powers of the living dead. MC replied, of course, he hadn't thought of it that way. Currently, he said, as the Lord of House Marvus, he calls upon them, Elysia and Helen, to answer the Master's call. Two different energies emerged from the book, and then the silhouette of a girl. MC looked at her and asked, he had summoned both of them, hadn't he? Why did only one of them come? Marvus asked, wasn't it obvious? They were originally supposed to be born as one person. After death, their spirits merged and embodied as one. Carleen answered as he says, Lord Marbas. Rachel said, how interesting. Valter looked at her in surprise and asked, but it seems like something has changed in their behavior. Don't they think? Something is a little off. MC asked, Elysia Helen? Which one is she? The girl closed her eyes and then answered, Elysia is with them at the moment. Lyon asked, does this mean they can change whenever they want? The girl answered, she thinks so, Lord. MC spoke, and it really is incredible. Elysia lowered her gaze and said, there is only one problem, Lord. MC asked, the problem? Elysia's eyes flashed and asked, is she joking, sister? She obliged them to serve this guy. It would be better for her to return to a charred body. Rachel said, so this is the change of souls, he believes. It seems Lady Helen hid her true self in life. Helen put her finger to her lips and said, better keep quiet, handsome. She is speaking with his grace. MC said, getting to the point. What skills can they offer him, ladies? He is afraid the useless living dead will be returned to the afterlife. They themselves understand he can still bind so many useful dead to the Necronomicon. Helen said how casually he said such frightening things. She bowed and said, he has nothing to worry about, Lord. Soon he himself will understand that they are more than capable of satisfying him in every sense. For example, she grabbed his cloak and pulled him to his face. She asked, would this method not interest him, her sweetie? After a while, Raleigh said, so, the mission is completed. She never would have thought that everything could end like this. Carleen said, His Grace can confirm that the mission is complete. They would like to receive payment. Raleigh clutched her head and sighed loudly. Rachel smiled and said, he must admit, that was quite a performance. It took a lot of courage, raising his daughter as a living corpse right in front of her father. Helen asked, what was he staring at? A mage. She belonged only to Lord Lion and no one else. Rachel nodded, and Marbus commented on how energetic she was for a holy virgin brought back from the dead. MC replied, it's hard to say. He doesn't know if it's strange, but he likes her even better this way. Valter raised his hand and said, if they allow it, it's not for him to say, but all's well that ends well, right? The girls are alive, well, with a few caveats of course, but still. Raleigh folded her arms and said, okay, she'll credit them for the mission. Now they can officially be assigned silver-ranked adventurer status. She told them to wait for payment. It will be sent straight to Marbus's mansion. Lion thanked the guild leader Raleigh, but he hoped this wasn't their last mission. Raleigh replied, she assures him he'll be the first to hear if a worthwhile mission arises for them. Carleen spoke up. She vouched for her words. She doesn't throw them around. If there's anything worth worrying about, Lord Marbus, it's making timely payments on the loan. Rachel stuck out his tongue and said with displeasure, horrible. What blatant hypocrisy, Lady Carleen. She pulled out a revolver and pointed it at his head. Marbus said with displeasure, enough of this idle chatter. They should move on. Two personalities inside that lady, Elysia and Helen. Ray must first find out what powers the newly minted servants possess. Carleen smiled and said, she thinks they're forced to insist on doing her as many favors as possible. Lady Raleigh Finalia. Raleigh poured the drink on the table and said, ugh. After a while, Caliban bowed and said, summing up, His Eminence refuses to eat or drink, completely immersed in the abyss of despair. He felt like the loss of both his daughters was taking a heavy toll on him. Louis adjusted his hair and frowned, asking why worry about a couple of children when he could conceive 10 more. Only a weak man would allow himself to be consumed by despair. Louis turned and looked at the Emperor. He asked if he cared how much he had failed His Majesty. A precious opportunity to give the world a wonder maiden wasted. Who knew when another would present itself? Caliban spoke. It was his fault. His prince. If he was only willing to give him a chance, he, Caliban, would gladly devote himself entirely to serving the Empire. Louis frowned and replied, yes, it was high time. Now they would have a serious talk. He understood that his mission was thwarted by a dark mage of unknown origin, and he was not even close to unraveling the mystery of his identity. Was he? Caliban looked up and replied. Regretfully, he reported that it was so. Considering that the spirits of potential saints had vanished without a trace, he assumed they had been intercepted through outside interference. However, as far as he knew, there wasn't a mage on the entire continent capable of controlling such power, with the exception of the legendary Necromancer, who had disappeared long ago, he supposed. Louis asked thoughtfully, a Necromancer? He said, after a while. MC and his team stood in the forest. Raleigh asked, well, she ordered him to lay it out. What power does his newly minted servant possess? MC replied, to be more precise, 2 souls inhabit her body, each endowed with its own power. Raleigh asked again, 2 souls in one body? Lion waved his hand and asked to let him demonstrate. Can she arrange a suitable target for them? Raleigh asked how strong a target he needed. MC replied, an exceptionally strong one, if she would allow it. He looked at the girl and said, first, he would like to demonstrate the powers of her sister, Elysia. She replied, as he wishes, sir. Elysia released mana from her body, then bowed and apologized for their insolence, sir. Her little sister disregards manners. MC replied that everything was fine with him. He had summoned him to demonstrate her skills, not to scold her behavior. Elysia smiled and replied, I understand. Then she's ready at any moment, sir. Rally waved her hand, and huge monsters appeared from the ground. Richelle asked, is this a squad of forest trolls? These monsters are known for their rapid regeneration. And considering that Elysia is just beginning to master her abilities, Carleen said it might be difficult for her. However, Lord Lion has repeatedly demonstrated that recklessness is alien to him. Valter clenched his fist and shouted, he believes in him, Lord Lion. Crow folded his arms and said, Crow's faith in his lord is unshakable from the start. Marbas spoke, said a dim-witted fool who lamented the fact that he was short of peanuts. MC said, trolls are tough guys. Can she handle it, Elysia? She loudly asked the master not to worry. The trolls rushed toward her, and MC quickly opened his book. A weapon appeared in Elysia's hands, with which she quickly struck the monster. Marbas's eyes widened in surprise, and he said, he supposes such a brutal display of force leaves no questions about her suitability. Isn't that right, Crow? He replied that Crow was shocked himself. A true femme fatale. Someone just asked to see how she crushes the skulls of her enemies with a club. Elysia quickly dealt with one of the monsters, then turned and looked at MC. He said thoughtfully, that's more than enough for a demonstration of strength. It was her younger sister, Helen's turn. He released dark mana towards the girl, after which Helen appeared. She said, she thought he wouldn't ask, sir. She loves to show herself off in all her glory. How can you not want the whole world to know how diligent she is? She created a long chain and wrapped it around the monster's neck. Helen laughed and said, nasty monsters deserve a sound spanking. Don't they think so? She knocked the monster to the ground and then stomped on its head with her foot. Helen grabbed her face and said, he should say thank you, monster. He gave his life for her beloved lord. Everyone looked at this in surprise, and Marbas shook his head and said, no matter how you look at it, she's an incorrigible maniac. After a while, Lion looked at the coat of arms and said, so, they finally returned to Marbas's lands. Marbas spoke accurately, and with the first mission successfully completed, they will add to this the replenishment of the ranks with useful subordinates, and one can say that the excursion was a success. MC nodded his head and said that he agreed with him. Lord Marbas. He would add that he felt some improvement in his skills in the art of necromancy. Valter said that he still regretted that their companions could not stay longer. Richelle extended his hand and said that he was glad to personally greet the rising star of the Eremite school, Lord Marbas. Carleen said, indeed, and she asks not to forget that he still owes their organization a large sum. MC shook Richelle's hand and asked, does this mean their journey together has come to an end? Richelle replied, he fears that is so, young lord. He too cannot be absent from the school for long. Carleen said, and she still has many debtors with unspent blood. Money does not wait. Marbas spoke, she speaks the truth. Carleen turned and spoke before they left. Sir Valter, is it? He replied, yes, my lady. Carleen said, his master's extraordinary genius eclipsed his own, but it was also worth noting that he was blessed with talent that most could only dream of. Not that she had a keen eye for such things, but the head of her organization would certainly be impressed. Richelle smirked and said that if he were him, he would pray never to meet that lady. MC asked, why not, Sir Richelle? Richelle replied, in short, she's a real monster. He understood. The employees are a match for their boss. Let him just know that the leader of the sleepers is on a whole new level of brutality. But even he acknowledged Sir Valter's immense potential. He believed he was capable of achieving anything he set his mind to, as long as he loyally served Lord Lion. Valter looked slightly embarrassed and thanked Sir Richelle and Lady Carleen. He must admit, it's not often he hears kind words from others. MC said he was definitely the most outstanding of his subjects. He dared to say his potential could exceed all their expectations, and he planned to help him blossom into his full glory. Richelle laughed and said, when Lord Marbas spoke with such confidence, it was wonderful. And now it was time for them to say goodbye, but not forever, of course, just until the next time chance brought them together. Lion replied, of course. It's best to say goodbye with a smile on your lips, isn't it? Carleen said, well, it's time for them to move out. Since he was a full-fledged member of the guild, she hoped he wouldn't have any trouble repaying his debt on time. MC looked down and replied warily, yes, Lady Carleen. Richelle smiled and asked, come on, why say goodbye on such a strained note? Carleen pulled out a revolver and pointed it in his direction, and he shouted, just don't shoot. They started to leave, and Carleen turned around and said that there was hardly anything she hated more than a company prone to empty chatter. She hoped that the next time they met, he would be able to pay the bills. Have a safe journey, Lord Marbas. MC nodded and watched them go. After a while, Lion returned to the city, where he was met by surprised townspeople. They said, the Lord has returned. Praise the Lord, he did not abandon them. Thank him, Lord. He doesn't even know what to say. MC asked, why do people look so surprised? Suddenly, a loud cry was heard. Young Lord! Pullen was running down the street and crying with happiness, his arms outstretched. MC slightly bowed his head and asked, Sir Pullen? Suddenly, someone hit him on the head and screamed, lie on. He turned around in surprise and asked, Diana, is that her? Valter asked in fear, is he okay, my lord? Pullen clung to MC and cried with joy. Lion turned and suggested discussing this inside. Marbas replied, yes, that would be better. After a while, he said, in short, this girl, is she his childhood friend and the heiress of the noble house of Phyrexia? MC replied, yes, and she's also a remarkable spirit caster. She was always ready to help him. Crow grinned and asked, "The gentleman is quite the Casanova, huh?" Another beauty in the retinue. Diana said she was puzzled here, Lord Marbas. She never thought she'd see Lord Lion, who was like a brother to her in the company of a demon. What should she think of such an unholy alliance? Marbas smiled and replied, "Let her think what she wants." Pullen said, "He must admit it's a long story." Crow said, "Whatever happened, happened." Walter apologized to Lady Diana and said he was afraid. It was truly hard to explain. Diana sighed and said, "Let them kill me." She doesn't understand. Why, in the name of all that is holy, get involved in such difficulties? Okay, so be it, Lion. But how did he even come up with the idea of leaving the estate without disclosing the reasons and personally joining some guild? His subjects were completely desperate, because they thought the Lord had abandoned them in difficult times. MC replied, "There is no excuse for him, Diana. Thank her for looking after the estate in his absence." Diana, slightly embarrassed, adjusted the strands of her hair and said that she couldn't abandon Pullen to its fate. Besides, she was told that he would soon return to power. Lion said, "I understand. Are there any other reasons why she came to him?" Diana looked at him in surprise, and then lowered her head and said, "She came to make sure that everything is in place, because there is not much time left." He understands what she is talking about, right? MC asked again, to make sure that everything is in place. Diana asked him to lean closer. She flicked him and said it was punishment for forgetting such an important matter. MC looked up and asked, "Is it important?" Diana said, and he finally understood. A meeting of aristocrats. All noble houses are invited to a major celebration. Besides, they must attend the ball as partners. After all, they are engaged, if he remembers. After a while, Knox was lying on the bed, and the butler said, "Young master, the day of the creation of aristocrats is already near." Nosk said, Yes, how tiring. Can't his older brother participate there? He doesn't understand at all why he suddenly has to." The butler replied, "3 noble families of darkness must attend the meeting. Moreover, this is a great opportunity to prove that the youngest descendant of the Reinhofer family is not an outcast in high society." Nick stood up and exhaled loudly. He said, "What a hassle." After a while, MC was getting dressed, with Pullen helping him, and Diana was standing in front of him. Diana de Varecchia, the future Marchioness and rising star of House Varecchia, a longtime ally of House Marbas and MC's betrothed. Lion asked, "He should be there, right?" Helen screamed, "Master, how could he?" She thought he was the only faithful man in this world of debauchery. Diana ordered her to calm down and said their engagement was just a formality. What self-respecting aristocrat would marry such a boy? She assured her that she was only interested in older men, wiser and more mature. MC nodded and asked how she would say it. Marbas asked how she was. "A contractor?" Crow shouted loudly. "What does this all mean, butler? Is this all for the master's good too?" Pullen wiped away his tears and replied, "Well, you could say that." He understood that Lord Lion and Lady Diana had been living like cats and dogs since childhood, bound by obligation. Their esteemed houses boast generations of friendship, which is why they were forced to survive in such, he would say, close ties. MC spoke up, in deference to their close bond. "My lady, would she please let go of his collar?" Diana looked at him with displeasure and said it was foolish to think he would change after becoming the head of the family. She was disappointed. He was still the same boy Lion she knew. Lion said she knew how they say that someone who changes with the wind cannot be trusted. Diana chuckled and said, "He is as sharp-tongued as ever, but it is better that he use it to calm his frightened subjects. It is true, the apple does not fall far from the tree." Suddenly she stopped and turned around and asked Lion for forgiveness. He replied, "She has nothing to apologize for, Diana. His father never regretted anything until the very end, and he never will. Still, it's the Marbas' duty to defend what they believe in, even at the cost of their lives." Diana waved her hand and said, "He's as stubborn as ever, but even so, he can't afford to miss the upcoming event. While she understands him completely, she can't stand them either. But House Marbas defeated Sylvester in the War of the Noble Houses. Therefore, he has lived up to his ducal title. It was time to introduce themselves to the public and establish social contacts. MC said he thought so too, to be honest. Pullen said it hadn't escaped him the disdain with which the other great houses treated them. Lion said if it was for the good of the house, so be it. Walter said joyfully, they would finally get the recognition my lord deserves. Crow folded his arms and said thoughtfully, "That's wonderful. He is wise enough to choose the best." MC spoke up. Then it was decided he would join the upcoming festivities. After a while, the aristocrats gathered at the reception. Lion sat at the table and sipped wine, and a man asked if it was true that Sylvester had lost the last territorial battle. He had heard rumors that Count Alan had suffered a crushing defeat. The guy asked, "Yes, and who did they lose to?" The man replied, "Believe it or not, but they say it's Marbas." Rebay asked, "Is that really true? The Marbas may hold the title of Duke, but things have been worse for them in recent years. Where will they find the strength to fight? This is nonsense, come on." The man said, he assures him it's the absolute truth. Otherwise, he froze and pointed towards the entrance. The man said, "Mention the demon, there he is, Lord Marbas himself. They can ask him personally. His god, he's just a spitting image of his father." Lion held Diana's hand and spoke, and it was even noisier in here than he expected. Still, lavish receptions are not his thing. Liana looked at their intertwined hands and felt slightly embarrassed. She turned away and asked, "Does he think she likes this?" Such is the duty of an aristocrat at all times, to feign nonchalance. MC turned around and said, "That's right. Thanks for the reminder, Diana. Although she has known Lion since childhood, their last meeting embarrassed her. His zeal to fulfill his duty as head of the family is so great that he would jump into the lion's mouth for his home. Does he really strive to become such a man? Lion asked. The others will manage on their own, right? After all, their talent has yet to blossom in all its glory. Diana grinned and said, the 14-year-old boy said he should worry about his talents. MC said, in fact, in social standing, he already surpassed her. Diana asked, did he have to be clever in response to every phrase? A voice suddenly rang out. Young Lord Marbus. MC turned and answered, that's him. Does he want something, my dear man? Rebe replied, nothing special. He wondered, was it he who defeated Alan? He may have been a simple count, but by aristocratic standards, his military might was comparable to an entire duchy. Maybe all this was just an exaggerated rumor? Rebe grinned and said he'd heard strange rumors about his victory in a noble war against Count Alan de Sylvester. Doesn't that even sound strange? MC asked again. What's so strange? Rebe looked at him with displeasure and mentally ordered him to just watch. So much arrogance between the two of you and that lady. He laughed and apologized. It was just hard to even imagine. If the rumors weren't exaggerating, he'd gladly learn strategy from him. Lion interrupted him and said he'd taken his life. Rebe asked again, puzzled. What? MC replied. He killed Alan de Sylvester, that's all. That was his duty as the head of the Marbus clan. As for strategy, he couldn't possibly share it here. And besides, if he suddenly decided to stand in his way one day, he'd see how much of his tactical mastery he'd gained there. Diana's eyes widened in surprise, and Marvis said, he spoke like a maniac. Nox looked at them from the side, and then stood up and said, well, finally some decent entertainment. Sometime later, the guests at the banquet asked what all the noise was about. Did young Lord Marbus really want to make a fool of himself? They hoped it wasn't for his own good. His family had already received enough ridicule. Marvis said they could discuss it as much as they wanted. Did it matter to them? The protagonist said that if he had no more questions, he would leave. Rebe stopped him with his hand and asked why he was so easily angered. However, if his behavior was merely mocking the Varela family, then he was obliged to hold him accountable. The protagonist denied any such behavior. Moreover, it was he who had first mocked Marbas's victory. He sternly declared that he had responded with an outrageous remark, which in the aristocracy is tantamount to a declaration of war. Diana declared, calling them gentlemen, that she suggested they stop. She said with a smirk, turning to Rube, that she wanted to point out that, as a representative of a collateral branch of the Varela family, he had no right to speak on their behalf. He wasn't even the heir, and yet he had somehow gotten into a fight with a full-fledged duke. By aristocratic standards, this was blatant disrespect. Was he prepared to answer for this to the fullest extent? Rube looked at her with a wild gaze, and gritting his teeth, declared that they shouldn't think that one victory would change anything. That applied to her too. She noted that perhaps she would have been frightened by this ominous warning if it had come from a frightening man. However, that clearly wasn't the case with him. He had shouted that she was being too provocative. Nox had said that he should spare them his screeching. Rube had turned around and shouted, how dare he insult him? Suddenly he froze in place with fear, only his hands trembling. MC thought that suddenly all his courage had vanished. Who was he? He recognized that appearance. He approached him and asked if he had forgotten who he was. Marbus declared, addressing the contactor, that he must exercise caution. This man was the most dangerous of them all. Nox grabbed him by the collar and menacingly asked if someone like him even deserved to report to him. At that moment, Walter asked Pullen if he thought Diana could handle it. Pullen nervously replied that, of course, she could handle it. Although this was their first time attending a banquet of such a scale, he noticed that his voice sounded unsure. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't want to admit it, but his doubts were not unfounded. As he knew, their master was too careless. He was afraid he would be drawn into a scandal without them even knowing about it. Walter noted that they didn't simply serve him, they needed to believe in him. Pullen agreed with that. Fortunately, Diana was accompanying him. She can handle his temper. He asked what he knew about her anyway, besides the fact that she was the master's fiancée. Puzzled, he asked where to begin. To tell the truth, their engagement meant nothing. Walter asked what he meant. Pullen said that Diana was more like an older sister to him, with a significant age difference. He was sure it wouldn't surprise him much to learn that she was older than him. They were greatly indebted to her for the many years she had cared for a master with such a disposition. He said he now understood. So their relationship was more of a family than a love affair? He noted that, to put it simply, it was. However, she was the last reason for doubt at this event. He had heard rumors that a dormant dragon of high society would be attending this banquet. Walter asked in surprise if they were talking about him. Pullen said that they were. He is an impudent young lord, shunned by all, belonging to one of the three noble families of darkness, like their lord, Lion. He is the youngest son of House Reinharber, whose line has long since eclipsed the weakened House of Marbus. His name, if he remembers correctly, is Nox. At the banquet, Nox announced, introducing himself, that he must remember this name well, unless, of course, he is interested in preserving his body for the rest of the evening. Rube bowed his head and shouted that he begged the noble lord's forgiveness. He would not have thought to raise his voice if he had known that before him stood a distinguished descendant of House Reinharber. He was begging him to have mercy on his foolishness. He poured the contents of his glass over his head and told him he was a boring aristocrat, just as he considered him. It was a waste of good wine and his time. Then Nox laughed loudly, while the others looked at him. He left an upturned glass on Ribe's head, who loudly apologized to him. The protagonist asked, when he approached him, if they knew him. Nox said he was sure he had heard of him before. Diana addressed him by name and remarked that he was the young lord of a great house that opposed the nobles of the House of Light. He certainly expressed contempt in the worst possible way. He asked with a smirk. So that's all she could say after he helped them? Nox asked. His name was Lion, wasn't it? He believed they would soon become very close. The protagonist declared that if it was in his family's interests, he would only be glad of it. He noted with a smile that he was a truly exemplary head of his family. This was quite interesting. He looked forward to their next meeting. Then Diana noted that, according to rumors, Nox was not recognized in the family. She doubted they would see each other often, and he had better be careful around him. MC asked if that was all she'd managed to find out about him. She asked, puzzled, if he had any objections. Marbas, addressing the contactor, declared himself as insightful as ever. Nox resembled him in some ways, the same unrivaled genius. He regretted being in the shell of such a hooligan. Lion mused, calling him master, that he had the same impression of him. He hadn't sensed such an intense and dense dark mana before. He mentioned that they would soon become close, and he had no doubt about it. After a while, the maid turned to Nox and said she apologized to her master for her insolence. Why had he helped that guy? I mean, he prefers not to get involved in trivial matters. Nox said she just needed to look, and she would see for herself. She asked what she needed to see. He declared that he was absolutely certain that soon there would not be a soul left on the continent who did not know his name. The maid looked at him, puzzled. Nox remarked that no matter how he performed, it would still be a worthy spectacle. They should go home. He was already tired. At this point, Diana took Lion's hand and, addressing him by name, told him to follow her. Although it was a formality, it would be better for him to play the groom in public. The protagonist said that she was probably right. However, what exactly should he do? She asked with a smile. He still remembered the basics of dancing, right? Most likely his late father had taught him. The protagonist nodded his head in agreement and took her hand. Afterwards, they began to dance to the music alongside the other banquet guests. Diana looked into his eyes and thought with a smile on her face that he was a good dancer. Still, there remained something of the charming boy she'd known before. She noted, looking away, that he still wasn't her type. MC asked, addressing her by name, what she meant. Diana cheerfully replied that it didn't matter. He didn't have to think about it, and he didn't need to count his steps so intensely. He could simply pretend to dance. Lion declared that his late father had taught him that a noble lord must perform at his best in every endeavor, after which the protagonist pulled the girl closer, placing his hand on her waist. She sheepishly thought that he was as zealous a head of the house as ever. But was he really pulling her so close out of some sense of duty? They continued dancing, their gaze locked, while the other guests began to discuss them. Diana exhaled and said with a smile that he was still as immensely respectable in all areas, even the most unexpected. The protagonist noted that he would like to say the same about her, but she is not as flexible as before. She irritably said with a smile that he should shut up. That was enough for him. Suddenly, to their surprise, a loud crash was heard, and people shouted about the noise outside. Didn't they understand how a fight at a noble's meeting would affect them? Then they shouted that it seemed like a one-sided beating, not a fight. But who would dare do such a thing? After a while, MC and Diana emerged from the banquet hall to find their allies being attacked by an unknown assailant with a sword. Walter glared at his opponent, and Diana angrily asked Ribe if she hoped he could explain the reason for the outrage. Ribe crossed his arms and looked at her smugly, saying she was just in time. She declared she didn't want to have to repeat herself. But what had happened? He asked with a smirk. Wasn't her voice too commanding when there was no powerful patron nearby? Marbas thought this idiot had imagined himself a lion after the Snow White wolf had left the stage. These so-called aristocrats were going crazy over the slightest thing. Leon sat down next to Pullen and commanded Ribe to explain in detail exactly what his subordinate had done wrong. Walter looked at him with fear. Not long before, Ribe's servant had asked the master if he was all right. Ribe had furiously shouted at him to shut up. They were completely useless, insignificant clowns. He thought this was bad. At that moment, Walter asked Pullen if the aristocratic gatherings were simply an opportunity to give the younger generation a chance to socialize and make connections within their own society. Pullen replied with a smile that they were indeed so. Such events were especially important for the Marbas family now, given how tarnished their reputation had become. Yet another reason to thank Lady Diana. It was extremely kind of her to accompany the gentleman to the reception. He remarked with a smile that they seemed to value each other greatly. He cheerfully said that they had been wonderful friends since childhood. Ribe addressed them rudely and asked if they were also the scum of the Marbas family, weren't they? Pullen nervously wondered if this was the young heir of the Varela family. What did he want from them? He politely replied that he was right, but he couldn't help but notice his insulting tone. Why was he trying to provoke a conflict so blatantly? He chuckled and asked what provocation he was talking about. Those were too strong words for a small butler. Then Ribe called his subordinate by name and ordered him to get rid of them. Coleman, Ribe's subordinate, worriedly noted that they were near the Duke's estate. He didn't want to disobey his orders, but to defy common sense. Ribe declared that fallen aristocrats deserved only contempt. He must stop doubting and act. He grabbed the hilt of his sword and said that disobedience would only result in death. He should take up his weapon if he considered himself a knight. Pullen said he shouldn't give in to such obvious provocation. They couldn't afford another confrontation just yet, and they wouldn't add to the master's problems either. Walter tried to retreat, but at that moment his ally was attacked, and he anxiously shouted out his ally's name. Then Walter became angry, and Pullen shouted that he should calm down, that he was fine. They should think better of the master. Coleman put his foot on the butler's head, and Walter pushed him away with his hand, grabbing his sword. He shouted that he had to stop. He declared that he wouldn't cause any trouble. He simply wanted to protect him. After all, he was as dear to him as the young master. Ribe said with a grin that it looked charming. Let them both regret their loyalty. They began to fight, exchanging blows and parrying lunges. After Walter was thrown back, he braced himself for the enemy's attack. Diana asked if she hoped they could explain the cause of the outrage. After a while, the banquet guests asked if the scum of the Varela family was causing trouble again. Although this was some kind of entertainment, now they would find out whether the Marbas family's victory over Sylvester was just a fluke. The noble lady asked if it wasn't obvious. Where did such a young man get the strength to fight? They said she had made a good point. They hoped the families of darkness would simply destroy each other in the end. Ribe asked, turning to Leon, if he would like to have a training sparring match with him. The guests would appreciate it. The protagonist declared that it was an excellent idea. He understood his challenge. Diana, dumbfounded, shouted his name. The protagonist used his abilities, and the opponent ordered his minions to attack him. Coleman approached him, and the MC remarked, addressing Walter, that he had expected more from him. Walter lowered his head and said he apologized to his master. He couldn't resist letting him down. Leon said he was wrong. It was something else. At that moment, the opponent attacked, and the protagonist used his powers to deal critical damage. Everyone stared in surprise at the protagonist, who sternly declared that he had hoped that for Pullen's sake, he would fight with all his fury. He wanted to proclaim one fundamental principle of the Marbas family. The undead suddenly appeared, and Pullen looked at his master, puzzled. The MC declared that they kill without hesitation when necessary. This concerns both the prosperity of their family and the safety of their loved ones. And it doesn't matter who gets in their way. Even if it puts him at risk, he wants them to uphold this principle. Shortly before this battle, inside the estate, the Rebe was kneeling, humiliated, when suddenly someone approached him, and he shouted, "What do you want?" Was he going to mock his shame? Then the Rebe cried out in fear that it was His Highness. He was begging him to forgive him for his rudeness. He hadn't thought the Crown Prince would approach him. Louis smiled, addressing him by name, and said he could forget about formal behavior. He declared that it was a great honor for him to remember the name of a humble servant. He said they could get along without unnecessary pleasantries. The Rebe said he understood. Louis remarked that he had seen a certain scene involving him, and he wanted to confess that it amused him. He asked if he was talking about the quarrel involving the lords of the Marbas and Rheinharbor families. He said that was exactly it. He was not one to resist his curiosity. Therefore, he wanted to know something from him. Why had two lords of darkness suddenly united against him? He found it hard to believe they'd been on such good terms until now. Besides, he'd suddenly received the strange news of the Marbas family's victory in the recent noble war. Rebe said, addressing His Highness, that it was truly strange. Louis asked with a wicked smile, placing a hand on his shoulder. Perhaps then, with a little help, he could lift the veil of secrecy about these vultures' true intentions for him. Rebe had thought that, ever since Rheinharbor had left that event, the Marbas lord had been nothing but a fanged predator. He could easily defeat him with the Crown Prince's help. He couldn't let this opportunity slip. He declared with a smirk that his wishes were his command. At that moment, Rebe thought he'd made a grave mistake. He declared, while being seized by the undead, that it was a grave sin for a noble lord to brush it aside. Was it right for a man of his status to interfere in the simple squabbles of servants? The protagonist asked. So to him, they are just ordinary servants? However, where he sees insignificant servants, he sees loyal people. Rebe clenched his fist and asked, but why go so far for them? The protagonist noted that he had already said that they kill without hesitation when necessary, and there would be no exceptions. Afterward, MC ordered Walter to take Pullen to the doctor, who said he understood his order. Diana, addressing him by name, said that she was naturally on his side, but he should stop. A man from a collateral branch of a noble house posed no real danger to the Marbas family. This was too high-profile a matter to be aired publicly. He would be wiser to retreat. Lion remained silent, and at that moment, Rebe gestured to his henchman, who grabbed Diana. Marvis declared this a primitive method. He asked with a smirk, what will he do now? He needed to retreat immediately, or he would test the limits of his hypocritical farce without hesitation. Rebe asked, pointing his index finger at Diana. He wouldn't want his toy to get scratched, would he? The protagonist said thoughtfully that, in Lady Diana's case, he was the toy. He should get his eyes checked. Marbas slapped his forehead with his paw, thinking the contractor was incorrigible. Rebe remarked that he knew perfectly well he wouldn't let this girl get hurt. How about calling off these undead and dispersing without a fight? The other nobles were already watching the situation with displeased expressions. The protagonist remarked that if he didn't understand, he'd say it again. Not only had he pestered his subordinates for no reason, but he'd also decided to threaten Lady Diana, hadn't he? MC used his abilities and declared that his servant's injury wouldn't be the end of it. Rebe thought that was odd. An ominous chill filled the air. Lion asked angrily, was he deliberately tarnishing Lady Diana's honor? Marbas said he needed to hurry. Silence was often an admission of guilt. The protagonist mused, as if his words, as always, were teaching him wisdom. The protagonist shouted, using his abilities, that in that case, death was the only worthy price. Rebe shouted that then the girl would die too. At that moment, Diana dealt a killing blow to the henchman holding her, after which, MC protected her with his abilities, while his undead destroyed the remaining opponents. He looked at his defeated henchman in horror, and Lion grabbed his face. Diana asked in surprise, but how was that possible? She thought she had heard rumors of Lion's suddenly increased power, but she had no idea he was so strong. Marbas remarked to Lady Diana that she must hold a special place in his contractor's heart. Diana said she didn't quite understand him. He remarked that this side of him was something new. He had never seen such a riot of emotion on his face before. Ruby cried out in fear, begging him to stop. The protagonist dealt him a decisive blow. The aristocrats asked in shock, could he really have decided to commit murder during a ceremonial meeting? And Lion had used necromancy, hadn't he? His magical art seemed inexperienced, but certainly terrifying. In high society, the Marbas family was seen in only two guises: a terrifying force before which any noble family trembled in fear, or an outcast awaiting their inevitable fall. Then Luis clapped and said, turning to Leon, that it was a beautiful sight. The protagonist asked if he really thought so. He thought it was unflattering for the vast majority. His tastes were rather peculiar. Diana nervously shouted his name. He said with a laugh that he wasn't offended by such words. Rather, he was inspired by the fact that he personally witnessed the return of the art of necromancy to the lands of Arkheim. After all, it had lain dormant for centuries in the inept hands of his predecessors. And how did he manage to master something no one else could? MC noted that he had been told he was a genius, although he himself did not consider himself one. Louis asked, so he was a genius born only once every 100 years, right? Lion said he wanted to repeat himself. It was not for him to judge. All he knew was that his strength had enabled him to withstand the enemy's onslaught and now stand before him as the head of the Marbas family. He said he understood him now. He hoped his talent hadn't been deemed a threat by the imperial line. The protagonist said with a smile, addressing His Highness, that the feeling was mutual, as long as nothing threatened the Marbas line. After which, Marbas remarked that he had said it well. Although more than one noble family will soon make their claims, the strength he's demonstrated will at least keep them quiet for a while, during which time they could quite possibly strengthen their position. The protagonist asked what exactly they should do now. He noted that, speaking of the prince, he was definitely planning something terrible. He had a demonic aura about him. MC said that he had indeed sensed an ominous aura himself. It seemed a demon was indeed involved. After some time, Lion returned to his room and thought that the situation had been resolved quite easily, as the Varela family hadn't made the slightest reproach, and they had returned home. Marbas said that he believed Prince Louis had personally hushed up the matter. He was definitely up to something. The protagonist said that he felt their path was only getting more complicated. They needed to somehow replenish the treasury, given their enormous debt, not to mention repairs to the mansion. He thought it was time to follow Lady Diana's advice. They need a competent treasurer. The protagonist recalled a past where Diana had stated that the more he tried to cope with his financial difficulties, the deeper their debt grew. He wasn't planning on passing on nothing but crushing debt, was he? MC mused that he wouldn't want that. Crow declared he had an idea. He just needed to become an archmage in the field of necromancy. Then death wouldn't be a threat to him, and he could manage his finances for eternity. Marbas said his idea was worse than the next one. He wouldn't allow a contractor to be in debt to loan sharks for the rest of his days. Helen asked if they could even afford a treasurer. A good manager would demand a substantial reward in any country and on any continent. Lion said they'd have to spend money. Marbas declared that they needed to worry about their current problems. They'd have to sacrifice something to succeed in the future. The protagonist agreed with the Lord. They will find a worthy financial manager for their Marbas clan. At this point, the protagonist said he felt they would have to make an announcement. Marbas asked what he was talking about. The MC remarked that there was little difference between aristocrats and commoners. If a person's skills were noteworthy, he would gladly hire them. He said with a smile that he now understood him. Lion said that, frankly, he would be more satisfied with a humble worker. Marbas said that these were the words of a miser. Crow shouted that it was impudent of a furry creature. How dare he mock a lord when he diligently saves for the sake of his clan? He asked, speaking of saving, but isn't a lot of money spent on nuts? He asked, dumbfounded. Is he serious? This is his reward for his previous journey. This is not up for discussion. The protagonist addressed Helen by name, and she asked what was going on. The protagonist asked for Pullen to be brought to him, and said that they needed to convene a council of the Marbas clan. Meanwhile, in the palace, Louis cheerfully remarked that he was an interesting guy. He just oozed it. He said as his mark appeared that he believed they had more in common than he thought. Sometime later, on the city streets, people reading an ad asked, "So the Marbas family needs a treasurer? Since when have they had the money for that?" They needed to show respect. Most likely, the new lord had a plan. The ad said he was willing to hire anyone, regardless of background. Why offer pay to commoners when he could hire a learned man? Did he even know most of them couldn't read? They wouldn't allow such people to manage the estate in his place. Siren watched them, clenching her fist. Sometime later, at the protagonist's estate, Marbas said that, in general, they needed a treasurer. However, he would have to agree to work for a paltry salary of 1 gold piece, right? Pullen, addressing the Marbas lord, said exactly that. While under the close supervision of the imperial family, they are not allowed to demand compensation for winning the noble battle of clans. Although Lord Lion has earned a considerable sum of money, most of it will go to pay off the estate's debts. The protagonist said that he had said anyway, they only had about 100 gold pieces for all expenses. That wouldn't last them a month. Crow shouted, "Why is this happening? Is this another crisis?" He's also demanding a contract. Lord Lion owes him fresh nuts. Walter noted that there would still be a crowd of people applying for the treasurer position. They should at least somehow survey them before making a decision, right? MC agreed with Walter. If they continued arguing, they wouldn't be able to decide anything. Pullen approached and straightened his clothes, and Marbas sighed heavily. Lion said they needed to go and look for applicants. After a while, a crowd of people gathered, waiting for the interview to begin. Suddenly, a man pushed the girl, and Siren asked who was pushing her. He asked with a smile, did she have any complaints? He couldn't even imagine that his competitors were such scum as she. She thought it was Alcar de Negishi, the third son of the Negishi family from the same small province where she lived, an obsessive suitor who had been stalking her lately. She suspected that he would follow her. Siren asked why he cared what she did. Alcar pointed out that, of course, he did. He placed his hand on her shoulder and asked, calling her by name, what kind of man would allow his fiancée to go so far? She silently pulled his hand away, and Alcar looked at her furiously. He declared that she needed to stop being stubborn. She knew herself that she was of too low birth to forget and start a new life, if she knew what he meant. Siren declared that his background was no better. Does he really think his status gives him the right to have anything he wants? Alcar said yes, at least a commoner like her. She said she wasn't his property. He asked fiercely if she could do that again. Siren declared that she would surpass him one day. Is it a problem that she's a commoner? Is that what makes her low class? However, she decides her own fate. Alcar asked if she really thought she'd be of much use to a noble family. They'd just be using her. She said that if it improved her life, she didn't mind. It was still better than marrying a scumbag like him. He grew angry and swung his arm, calling her trash. At the last moment, the protagonist appeared and used his abilities to stop him. Alcar wondered what that was. The protagonist asked if there was already a conflict happening in his trial. However, he was against disorder. They needed to remember that. MC sat in a prominent place and introduced himself as the head of the Marbas family. He proposed that they proceed without further delay to the test that would determine the future manager of the estate. Lion looked closely at Siren, who smiled slightly, noticing his glance. Marbas thought there was at least one worthy candidate. Perhaps their time would not be wasted. Among the skills Lion had acquired thanks to his deal with the demon Marbas was one special one, a piercing gaze, allowing one to peer into the very soul of a person. This is a trait inherent to demons. They always know exactly what inclinations their victims possess, and they seduce them with sweet promises, exploiting their inner self-doubt. Once the victim's will is broken, there is no escape. The next target to catch the Marbas demon's eye was a young woman. She possessed an iron will, stronger than anyone else in the assembled arena. The protagonist announced that the exam for the position of the new manager of the Marbas family estate was beginning. Afterward, the protagonist said that the first task he would set for them was to clearly understand the depth of their predicament. The map they were given depicted the entire territory of the Marbas family and its neighbors. He believed they all knew, in general, that they were currently experiencing financial difficulties. However, thanks to their connections with other noble families, he was confident they could overcome this crisis by selling resources and special goods. MC used his powers to summon an hourglass and asked if 10 minutes would be enough to put forward proposals for a solution to this problem. Siren studied the map carefully and began to make her own marks. She thought she needed to find a solution. The Marbas family's territory was located on the southern border of the continent. They had little trade potential in terms of special products or natural resources, with the exception of a single mine, but even that would be difficult to develop due to budget shortages. This was a rather questionable solution. Siren whispered that they also lacked manpower. She thought, as Alcar watched her closely, that it would be difficult to find an incentive to attract young people here. Hiring knights and mages was out of the question, given the lack of funds. The only advantage the Marbas family could hope for was this. He said he believed she would soon realize there was no place for a commoner among noble families. Siren glanced at him and returned to studying the map. Alcar said she wouldn't succeed anyway. He said, studying the map, that it was nonsense. After 10 minutes, Leon said that if they surrendered, they could leave without question. However, if anyone had any worthy proposals, he asked them to come to the podium and present them to them. The man raised his hand and said he would like to take a risk and present his proposal. Then he knelt, bowing his head in respect, and showing the map, he said that this was his plan. The Marbas estate had always been considered an impregnable fortress, with a small surrounding territory. There were few options for production or mining. Then he remembered that they had a mine in the mountains on their property, which hadn't been developed much. How could they pass up such an opportunity? What if there were plenty of rubies, sapphires, and other minerals there, highly sought after by the aristocracy? The protagonist asked, however, where would they get the money to develop this mine? The candidate said he didn't know much about the Marbas family treasury, but he hoped there would at least be enough funds for excavations. However, it would be possible to borrow money in the capital or from a trade association. The protagonist asked, what if a loan wasn't an option? He apologized, bowing his head, and said he hadn't considered that. The MC said, let the next candidate take the podium. Siren spoke up, while the others doubted she could handle it. She thought that such an opportunity only came once in a lifetime, and she had to seize it before someone else did.